Chapter 581. Ebony Tower 1. The first semester of my final year at Mythos Academy had come to a close. One more neatly boxed chapter in a long academic saga. I was still rank 1, still ahead of Lucifer, and still handling the weight of expectations with the quiet steadiness people had come to expect from me. I'd finished every assignment, attended every evaluation, and still carved out time for the people who mattered: Clara, the girls, and Lucifer himself. It was, all things considered, a successful term. And yet, the countdown had begun. Just one semester left. After that, I would step out of the artificial structure of Mythos and into something much less forgiving. But before that, winter break. A misnomer, really. There would be no break, no rest. This winter I was headed west. To the Ebony Tower. A place cloaked in reputation and legend. One of the great bastions of magical research in the Western continent. For most, it was an institution. For me, it was a promise, and an opportunity that could reshape the entire necromantic landscape. Ebony Tower. I'm surprised, Gene said as he leaned back in the plush leather seat of his family's private aircraft. The Ashbluff Royal crest was subtly embroidered into the headrest behind him, and he looked perfectly at home in the luxurious cabin. He always carried himself with more natural authority when surrounded by the trappings of his heritage. You're actually going through with it? I made a commitment to Paul Locrian, I said. I promised him a paper. A paper? Gene asked, though I could see the curiosity building behind his eyes. On how I formed an ancient undead. I clarified. Without a gift of deep dark. The words settled between us like a dropped stone in still water. Gene blinked, then blinked again. You're serious? I nodded. He leaned forward now, the aircraft's gentle hum providing a backdrop to our conversation as his princely composure cracked slightly. That's not just a paper, Arthur. That's a heresy in bone and rune. You're talking about overturning a millennium of necromantic doctrine. I simply shrugged. Sometimes doctrine needs overturning. Forming an ancient undead without a gift of deep dark had been considered impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The prevailing belief was that only those born with the gift could handle the formation rituals, the mental strain, and the cost in life force. The belief had become a law. The law had become a wall. The wall of talent. And I'd found a way through it. Paul Locrian's no fool, Gene continued, his voice dropping to something more serious. He reached high immortal rank. He's the Deputy Tower Master now. If he validates your method and successfully replicates it, the current Tower Master won't be able to hold his seat for long. You're essentially handing him a revolution. I'm aware, I replied calmly. But I'm not doing it for free. Gene raised an eyebrow. What's your price? 2 things. First, he helps me with my second necromantic summon. A higher order construct. Something that goes beyond current theoretical frameworks. I want to create something that bridges the gap between traditional necromancy and my integrated approach. And the second? A full partnership between Vauquert and the Western Necromantic Research Network. Jin's eyebrows climbed higher. Rose's company? I nodded. Vauquert is positioned well in the Slatemark Empire. Strong roots, flexible growth potential. But we lack influence in the West. If Paul agrees to this partnership, Vauquert's reach will spread through both continents. The necromantic economy will tilt in our direction permanently. Gene considered this, his sharp mind working through the implications as he gazed out the aircraft's window at the clouds below. He wasn't the type to praise easily, but when he spoke, his words carried genuine respect. Smart. Vauquert is already Ouroboros aligned. If you secure this, you'll turn the Slatemark necromantic market into a sealed loop while gaining access to Western innovations. The Western market is larger and more volatile, I agreed. But Slatemark's is small enough to control completely, and we've already done most of the groundwork there. This partnership will finish it. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. It would. But if you formed your lich as an ancient undead 3 years ago, why are you submitting the paper now? Gene asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. I didn't understand the theory behind it then, I admitted, scratching my cheek. I got lucky. Lucky. Jean blinked, his composure finally cracking entirely. The idea of classifying the greatest discovery in the field of deep dark and necromancy as luck was clearly doing damage to his princely sensibilities. But now I understand it completely since the limiter on my lich was removed when I advanced, I explained. I can now properly theorize and replicate the process. Jean shook his head slowly, a mixture of disbelief and admiration on his face, as the aircraft began its descent toward the western continent. Then, as if remembering something important, his expression shifted to something more formal. Actually, Arthur, that brings me to something else. He reached toward a secured compartment built into the aircraft's wall, withdrawing an ornate document sealed with the royal crest of the western continent. My father prepared this for you. I took the document, feeling the weight of high-quality parchment and the subtle magical protections woven into the seal. King Valen isn't meeting with me directly? He determined that you no longer need to be tested, Jean said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when speaking officially. This is the same contract he offered you before, the one contingent on proving your worthiness. But now, he gestured toward the document. He's concluded that your recent advancement and achievements speak for themselves. I broke the seal carefully, unfolding the document to reveal dense legal text written in both common and the formal script of the Western continent. As I read, recognition dawned. This was indeed the same contract from before, but now offered without conditions. The same terms as before, I said finally. Jean nodded. Father doesn't change his offers lightly. What you're seeing there are the same complete operating rights for Ouroboros in the Western continent he proposed before, but now given freely without the need for you to prove yourself through trials. I scanned the key provisions again, making sure I understood correctly. Preferential access to all royal research facilities, including restricted archives. Licensing for experimental necromancy that would normally require years of approval. And the right to recruit top necromancers from any Western institution, Jean finished, including the Ebony Tower itself, if you can convince them to join. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a business agreement. It was essentially a carte blanche to reshape the Western necromantic landscape according to my vision. And now it was being offered without the trials and tests that had originally been attached. The previous conditions? I asked. Waived, Jean said simply. Father believes your actions have already demonstrated everything the tests were designed to measure. Why now? I asked directly. Before, he wanted me to prove myself worthy of this level of support. What changed? Jin's expression grew thoughtful. Your advancement to ascendant rank through methods no one thought possible. Your revolutionary approaches to both magic and politics. Your consistent ability to exceed every expectation. He paused, looking out the aircraft window. Father originally designed tests to see if you had the capability to handle this level of responsibility. But watching your recent achievements, he's concluded that you've already provided all the proof necessary. I folded the document carefully, my mind already working through the possibilities this opened up. With royal backing, my visit to the Ebony Tower would be more than just an academic exchange. It would be the first step in establishing an empire that spanned continents. There are conditions, of course, Jean added. Of course. Ouroboros' activities in the West must align with royal interests. Any major experiments or developments that could affect continental stability must be cleared through royal channels. And, he paused, his expression growing more personal. You're expected to maintain the relationship that brought this opportunity about. I looked at him questioningly as the aircraft's engines shifted tone, indicating our approach to the Western continent. Your friendship with me, he clarified with a slight smile. Father values having a direct line to someone of your capabilities. Don't make him regret extending this trust. I wouldn't dream of it, I replied, and meant it. Jean had proven himself invaluable as both ally and friend. This agreement only strengthened the bonds that were already there. So, Jean said, leaning back in his chair again, ready to revolutionize Western necromancy? I tucked the royal agreement into my own spatial storage, feeling the weight of new possibilities settling around me like a familiar cloak. Let's find out. Chapter 582. Ebony Tower 2. Humans liked building towers. A lot. It was something woven into the DNA of civilization. When faced with power, knowledge, or the great unknown, someone would eventually look up and say, "Let's build something tall to poke it." And so, naturally, the world had a few of them. There was the Tower of Magic on the central continent, where spellcraft was dissected and reimagined in lecture halls ringed with runes. The Dragon Tower in the south, pulsing with bloodline experimentation and dangerous pride. The Constellation Tower up north, cold and gleaming, built for studying pure light. And finally, there was the Ebony Tower. In the west, the tower was a monument in black. It rose over a kilometer tall, shaped from seamless obsidian that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. A dark needle stabbing into the gray skies above, its surface so perfectly smooth it appeared almost liquid. No banners, no ornamentation, no pretense of warmth. Just sharp lines and silent authority. The kind of structure that didn't try to impress you with grandeur, it didn't need to. Dark energy pulsed through its walls like a heartbeat, visible as faint veins of deeper shadow that spiraled up its length. This wasn't just architecture. It was a declaration of purpose. "It looks much more ominous than it should," I said as our self-driving car curved up the long road toward the base. Even the air here felt heavier, filtered by perpetual clouds and the weight of 1,000 years of necromantic research. Jean barely reacted, his gaze fixed on the approaching tower with something like reverence. Function over form. The Ebony Tower doesn't waste energy on aesthetics. He looked completely at home here. Of course he did. The Western continent suited him. Its sharp architectural lines, muted color palette, and subtle undercurrents of barely restrained power. His posture, his tone, even the way he carried himself. It all seemed more refined here, more precise. He fit into this backdrop as naturally as obsidian into shadow. Everything here was black. Not metaphorically, literally. The buildings rose like monoliths of dark stone. The roads were paved with black granite that gleamed wetly under the overcast sky. The vehicles moved like sleek shadows. Even the fashion. Everyone wore variations of dark coats, deep grays, and midnight blues, as if they had all quietly agreed on a theme decades ago and never looked back. "It wasn't this monotone before," Luna muttered in my mind, static crackling at the edges of her voice. "What happened to color in this place?" I didn't answer immediately. Maybe it was cultural evolution. Maybe it was practical, dark colors hid the residue of necromantic experiments better. Maybe people here just liked the way black made them feel important. Or maybe, after generations of studying death magic, the aesthetic had simply grown on them. "Did you finalize the paper?" Jean asked, breaking the contemplative silence as the tower's shadow engulfed our vehicle entirely. "Naturally," I replied, eyes still fixed on the imposing structure. "Though I should clarify, the method I've developed doesn't eliminate the inherent difficulty of creating ancient undead. It shifts the challenge, makes it more accessible, but it's still far from trivial." Jean nodded thoughtfully. "So it's not democratizing necromancy." "No," I agreed. "It's creating a second path for the truly capable. Talented necromancers without a gift of deep dark will now have a viable route forward. But those with the gift will still find their innate approach more intuitive. My method is mechanical rather than instinctual. It requires more resources, takes longer, and has a higher margin for error. But it's reliable and, most importantly, reproducible." "A second gate," Jean murmured, "to a destination that's had only one entrance for over a millennium." He glanced at me with something between respect and wariness, though he would never voice either sentiment directly. "Creating ancient undead was never meant to be simple," he added. "It still isn't," I said quietly as we approached the tower's base. "But now it's possible for more than just the gifted. And sometimes possibility was enough to reshape entire civilizations." The car glided to a stop before the Ebony Tower's entrance, a massive archway that seemed to swallow light itself. No doors were visible. Instead, A wall of controlled darkness rippled like liquid shadow, scanning us as we approached. "Arthur Nightingale and Prince Jean Ashbluff," I announced to the shifting barrier. "We have an appointment with Deputy Tower Master Paul Locrian." The darkness pulsed once, then dissolved like morning mist, revealing a cavernous entrance hall beyond. The interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Polished black stone that reflected distorted images. Ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow, and the subtle but unmistakable presence of immense magical power humming through every surface. Robed figures moved through the space with purpose, their dark garments making them appear as mobile shadows. Some paused to nod respectfully to Jean, recognition flickering in their eyes. Others simply continued their business, too absorbed in their research or too important to acknowledge mere visitors. An attendant approached, a middle-aged woman whose pale skin contrasted sharply with her midnight robes. "Prince Jean, Mr. Nightingale, welcome to the Ebony Tower. Deputy Tower Master Locrian is expecting you on the 195th floor." She gestured toward a series of crystalline platforms that rose through the center of the tower like floating islands of black glass. No visible support, no mechanical apparatus, pure magical levitation sustained by the tower's ambient energy. "The ascension platforms will take you directly to your destination," she explained. "Please step aboard the central lift." We moved onto the nearest platform, and I felt the subtle shift as we began to rise. The sensation was remarkably smooth, like standing on solid ground while the world simply fell away beneath us. Through gaps in the tower's interior structure, I caught glimpses of laboratories, libraries, and research facilities that grew more sophisticated the higher we climbed. "Floor 100, Jean noted as we passed a particular level. "That's where they conduct the really dangerous experiments. Anything above floor 150 is restricted to high immortal rank researchers and above." "And floor 195? Deputy Tower Master Territory. Paul Locrian has been there for over 30 years. The platform continued its ascent, carrying us past levels that hummed with increasingly potent magical energies. By the time we reached the upper floors, the very air felt dense with power, the accumulated result of centuries of high-level necromantic research. "Floor 195, the platform announced in a voice like whispered silk. We stepped off into a corridor that was notably different from the lower levels. Here, the black stone was inlaid with silver runes that pulsed with gentle light, and the oppressive atmosphere gave way to something more refined, more controlled. The walls were lined with portraits of previous Deputy Tower Masters and displays of significant necromantic artifacts. At the end of the corridor stood a set of double doors crafted from what appeared to be fossilized dragon bone, their surface etched with protective wards so complex they made my eyes water to look at directly. The doors swung open silently as we approached. Beyond lay an office that managed to be both scholarly and intimidating. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with tomes that radiated knowledge and danger in equal measure. Artifacts of incredible power sat casually on pedestals, as if they were mere paperweights. The far wall was entirely transparent, offering a view of the western continent that stretched to the horizon. And behind a desk carved from a single piece of midnight black stone sat Paul Locrian. He looked exactly as I remembered from our brief meeting years ago, though perhaps with a few more lines around his eyes. Still tall and lean, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of presence that suggested immense power held under careful control. His robes were simpler than those of the other researchers I'd seen, but the quality of the material and the subtle magical enhancements woven into the fabric marked him as someone of exceptional status. "Arthur Nightingale," he said, rising from his chair with a slight smile. "You've grown considerably since our last meeting." "Deputy Tower Master Locrian," I replied with a respectful nod. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. Please, Paul is sufficient. And Prince Jean," he added, turning to acknowledge my companion. "Your father sends his regards, I trust?" "He does," Jean confirmed, "along with his continued support for mutually beneficial research initiatives." Paul's smile widened slightly. "Excellent. Now then, Arthur, I believe you have something for me." The paper you promised regarding ancient undead formation without deep dark gifts. I do, I said, reaching into my spatial storage to withdraw a bound manuscript. Though before I hand this over, I should confirm our agreement. You'll assist with my second necromantic summon project and facilitate a partnership between my organization and the Tower's research network. Assuming your paper lives up to its claims, Paul replied. Those terms are acceptable. The Tower is always interested in advancing necromantic theory, and if you've truly found a way to circumvent the gift requirement. He left the sentence hanging, but the implication was clear. Such a discovery would revolutionize the field. I extended the manuscript toward him. One way to find out. Paul accepted the paper with the reverence of someone handling a potentially world-changing document. He settled back into his chair and began to read, his expression neutral but intent. The silence stretched as he worked through the theoretical framework I'd developed. I watched his eyebrows rise incrementally as he progressed through the more complex sections, saw him pause to reread certain passages, noticed the way his breathing grew more controlled as the implications became clear. Jean and I waited, neither speaking. This was the moment of truth. Would my theoretical understanding of what I'd accidentally accomplished years ago hold up to expert scrutiny? Paul's hands began to tremble slightly as he reached the final sections. The paper fell from nerveless fingers as he completed the last page. His face pale with what looked like a mixture of awe and terror. And then, to my complete shock, Paul Locrian, Deputy Tower Master of the Ebony Tower, High Immortal Rank Necromancer, one of the most powerful and respected magical researchers in the world, slowly rose from his chair and dropped to his knees. Why can't anything in my life happen normally? Chapter 583. Ebony Tower, 3. Luna snorted at my thoughts, her amusement rippling through our mental connection like cold water. Of course, with you, how can anything ever be normal? She said, her voice carrying that particular blend of exasperation and fondness that had become her trademark. A simple academic paper exchange becomes a life-changing revelation. Typical Arthur. I chose to ignore her commentary as I often did. Despite being an ancient Chelan with millennia of experience, her input was more often than not simply unnecessary, and occasionally detrimental to my mental well-being. Right now, I needed to focus on the Deputy Tower Master of the Ebony Tower who was currently kneeling before me like I was some sort of divine figure. Please, Sir Paul, get up, I said, trying to inject some normalcy into what had become a decidedly abnormal situation. Paul Locrian remained on his knees for a moment longer, his hands pressed flat against the polished stone floor of his office. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a light I'd seen before, the fevered gleam of someone who had just witnessed the impossible made manifest. You don't understand, he breathed, slowly rising to his feet, but keeping his gaze fixed on me with unsettling intensity. This paper, what you've accomplished, it's not just a method for bypassing the gift requirement. It's a complete reconceptualization of how necromantic energy can be manipulated at the fundamental level. He moved toward one of his bookshelves, pulling out a thick tome bound in what looked suspiciously like human skin. For 30 years, I've been trying to understand why certain theoretical frameworks fail when put into practice. The mathematics were sound, the energy calculations perfect, but something was always missing. Paul opened the book, revealing pages covered in dense equations and necromantic diagrams. Your approach doesn't just solve the gift problem, it explains why our traditional methods have inherent limitations. The way you've structured the ritual circles, the energy flow patterns, the temporal sequencing. He paused, shaking his head in wonder. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I felt a familiar warmth creeping up my neck. The praise was deeply uncomfortable, primarily because I knew the truth. My initial creation of Erebus as an ancient undead had been largely accidental. I'd stumbled onto the method through a combination of desperation, intuition, and what Luna liked to call my supernatural ability to survive impossible situations through sheer bloody-mindedness. Are you going to tell him the truth? Luna asked with obvious amusement. That his new messiah of necromantic theory basically threw magical spaghetti at a wall until something stuck? Absolutely not. I'm glad the theoretical framework resonates with your research, I said instead, accepting the praise with what I hoped looked like modest confidence rather than shameless fraud. Paul continued his enthusiastic analysis. The implications are staggering. If this method can be replicated consistently, we're looking at a fundamental shift in how necromantic education is structured. The democratization of elite necromancy, Jean observed quietly. He'd been remarkably silent during Paul's revelation, but I could see him processing the political implications with characteristic thoroughness. Precisely, Paul exclaimed, turning to include Jean in the conversation. Though democratization might be too strong a term, the method Arthur has developed is still incredibly demanding. It requires theoretical knowledge that most practitioners never acquire, precision that comes only with years of experience, and resources that remain quite expensive. I nodded, seeing an opportunity. Speaking of resources, that brings us to our agreement. You mentioned assistance with my second necromantic summon project. Paul's enthusiasm immediately shifted toward the practical. Of course. What did you have in mind? With this theoretical breakthrough, I imagine you're planning something quite ambitious. This will be my final necromantic summon, I said, deciding that complete honesty about this particular aspect couldn't hurt. I want to create something that represents the absolute pinnacle of what my methods can achieve. Paul's eyebrows rose. Final summon? Are you planning to focus entirely on other magical disciplines? Something like that, I replied evasively. The truth was more complex. My integrated approach to magical and martial development meant that specializing too heavily in any single school would create imbalances. But explaining that would require revealing more about my capabilities than I was comfortable sharing.
Smart, Lunaka mented.
Let him think you're making a strategic choice rather than revealing the limitations of your unusual development path. In that case, Paul said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, we should discuss this thoroughly. Creating a final masterwork summon is not something to approach casually. He gestured toward a seating area near the transparent wall that offered the spectacular view of the Western continent. As we settled into chairs that were probably worth more than most people's annual salaries, Paul steepled his fingers and regarded me with academic intensity. Tell me about Erebus first, Paul said, settling back in his chair. When I examined him 2.5 years ago, he was already remarkable. An ancient undead created without a gift, though at the time I couldn't fathom how you'd accomplished it. Now that I understand your methods, I'm curious about his current capabilities. Erebus has evolved significantly since our last meeting, I replied. He specialized in magical support, battlefield control, and necromantic amplification. He can provide defensive enhancements, coordinate undead minions, and supplement my own magical capabilities during combat. And the limiters I detected during my initial examination? Removed when I advanced to Ascendant rank. He now operates at his full potential as an ancient undead. Paul nodded with obvious satisfaction. Excellent. A fully realized Lich with those capabilities provides an excellent foundation. He paused thoughtfully. Given Erebus's specialization in magical support and battlefield control, your second summon should complement rather than duplicate those roles. My thinking exactly. I need something that can handle roles Erebus isn't optimized for. Paul leaned forward, clearly in his element now. What's your preferred combat style? That will heavily influence the optimal summon design. Close-range combat primarily. I fight with a sword, prefer direct engagement over range tactics. Interesting. Most necromancers favor distance fighting, using their summons as shields while they cast from the back lines. Paul's eyes lit up with professional interest. You're thinking more like a Death Knight or a necromantic paladin. Combat necromancer rather than pure spellcaster. Jean spoke up. Arthur's advancement path has been unconventional. He's developed capabilities that don't fit traditional classifications. I shot him a grateful look. That was accurate without being revealing. Paul absorbed this information with obvious fascination. In that case, we have several potential directions. A direct combat summon to fight alongside you, a specialized support unit to enhance your close combat effectiveness, Or perhaps something focused on battlefield mobility and tactical flexibility. What would you recommend for materials? I asked, deciding to push my luck. Given the significance of this project, I'm willing to invest heavily in superior components. Paul leaned forward, his academic excitement evident. Given the extraordinary quality of materials I can provide and your unique combat style, I see several viable paths for your final summon. He pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began sketching while he spoke. With crystallized void essence, ancient dragon bone fragments, and concentrated soul gems from legendary class entities, we can create something truly exceptional. The first sketch showed a sleek, deadly figure. A Phantom Reaper designed for your close combat preferences. It would phase between physical and ethereal states during battle, striking with devastating precision before becoming untouchable. Perfect synergy with your sword work, essentially giving you a supernatural dueling partner. Paul moved to a second design. Alternatively, a Bone Colossus variant. Pure physical dominance optimized for your tactical needs. Nearly indestructible, capable of both protecting you and devastating enemy formations while you engage primary targets. The third sketch was more elaborate. A Spectral Warden balanced combat and tactical capabilities. It could adapt its role mid-battle, functioning as both warrior and coordinator depending on what the situation demands. I studied the options, each clearly designed around complementing both my fighting style and Erebus's support capabilities. But, Paul continued, his eyes lighting up with inspiration, given the theoretical breakthroughs in your paper and the quality of materials available, I believe we could attempt something more ambitious. His sketching became more complex. A modular construct, one entity capable of shifting between multiple configurations based on tactical requirements. I studied the three sketches carefully: the Phantom Reaper, Bone Colossus variant, and Spectral Warden. Each design was sophisticated, clearly the product of decades of expertise and deep understanding of necromantic principles. These are all impressive concepts, I said finally, but this is my final necromantic summon. I want to give this decision the consideration it deserves. Paul nodded approvingly. Wise. This kind of decision shouldn't be rushed, especially given the significance you've placed on it. Look at you being all responsible and thoughtful, Luna commented with amusement, almost like you've learned something about not diving headfirst into major magical projects. I'll need some time to think through the tactical implications of each option, I continued. How they would complement Erebus, how they fit with my combat style, what situations I'm most likely to encounter. Of course, Paul replied, clearly pleased by my careful approach. A decision of this magnitude deserves proper consideration. Take all the time you need. He leaned back in his chair, then seemed to remember something. Actually, that gives me an idea. Would you be interested in seeing the tower's restricted material archives? It might help inform your decision to understand exactly what components would be available for each design approach. Chapter 584. Ebony Tower 4. The elevator carried us higher through the Ebony Tower, past levels I hadn't seen during our initial journey to Paul's office. As we approached the 210th floor, the ambient magical energy grew noticeably denser, pressing against my consciousness like a physical weight. Fair warning, Paul said as the elevator slowed to a stop. The archive can be overwhelming on first viewing. We have materials here that most necromancers consider mythical. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that immediately felt different from the rest of the tower. The walls here weren't just black stone. They were lined with containment fields that hummed with barely restrained power. Protective wards layered upon protective wards created a sensation of walking through concentrated magic. At the end of the corridor stood Master Valdris, the archive curator. He was an elderly man whose appearance immediately commanded respect. Tall and lean with silver hair that seemed to hold traces of ethereal light. His robes were simpler than Paul's, but the magical aura surrounding him marked him as someone of extraordinary capability. Deputy Tower Master, Valdris greeted Paul with a formal nod before offering a deeper bow to Jean. Your Highness, it's an honor to have you grace our archives. Mr. Nightingale. His tone shifted to one of careful respect when addressing me, clearly recognizing the political dynamics at play. Master Valdris, Jean acknowledged with the casual authority of someone accustomed to such deference. I trust the tower's collection remains adequate for our purposes. There was something in Jin's tone that suggested this wasn't his first time seeing such materials. Valdris's expression tightened slightly at the word adequate, but he maintained his professional demeanor. Arthur here has contributed a revolutionary paper on necromantic theory, Paul explained. Given the importance of his final summon project, I've authorized full archive access for material evaluation. Valdris's eyebrows rose slightly. Full access? That's unprecedented for a non-tower member. The circumstances are exceptional, Paul replied firmly. The curator studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. Follow me and please touch nothing without permission. Some of these materials have unfortunate effects on the unprepared. This feels like walking into a vault of divine artifacts, Luna observed as we followed Valdris deeper into the archive. The magical density here is extraordinary. Even I'm impressed. The main archive chamber was vast beyond my expectations. The ceiling disappeared into shadow above us, and row upon row of storage units stretched into the distance like a crystalline forest. Each container glowed with its own protective enchantments, creating a constellation of colored lights that pulsed gently in the semi-darkness. We organized by beast classification and rarity, Valdris explained as we walked between the towering shelves. 1-star beast materials at the lower levels progressing upward. The organization system has been refined over 8 centuries of collection. He led us to the first section, where containers held what appeared to be fairly standard necromantic components. 1- and 2-star beast materials, your basic undead creation supplies. Bone fragments from common magical creatures, crystallized essence from forest spirits, standard soul crystals from minor undead. Even these basic materials were of higher quality than anything I'd expected to see. The bone fragments had a lustrous quality that spoke of careful preservation and enhancement. The soul crystals pulsed with steady energy that felt pure and concentrated. 3- and 4-star beast materials, Valdris continued, guiding us to the next section. Here we have components from more dangerous creatures. Shadow beast essences, dire wolf cores, materials from magical predators that require specialized hunting expeditions. I recognized some of the components from my research, but many were completely unfamiliar. The containers in this section required visibly more powerful containment fields, and the magical emanations made my skin tingle just walking past them. This is roughly equivalent to what most mid-tier suppliers can provide, Paul noted, watching my reaction. 5- and 6-star beast materials, Valdris announced as we entered a section that required additional authentication. He pressed his hand to a recognition panel, and new protective barriers dissolved around us. Components from creatures that pose genuine threats to integration rank practitioners. The difference was immediately apparent. These materials radiated power that I could feel in my bones. Crystallized essences from creatures I'd only read about in theoretical texts. Bone fragments that seemed to hold whispers of the beings they'd come from. Soul gems that pulsed with such intensity that looking at them directly was uncomfortable. Nightmare Stalker heart crystals. Valdris pointed to a container holding what looked like a black ruby, the size of my fist. From a 6-star abyssal nightmare. Provides tremendous power density but requires careful handling. The emotional resonance can overwhelm unprepared minds. Jean whistled softly, though his tone carried more polite interest than genuine amazement. Nightmare Stalkers. We have a few sets of those in the royal vaults as well. Paul's expression flickered with something between surprise and resignation. Of course, the Ashbluff royal family would have comparable materials. Their influence extended far beyond what most institutions could access. They're rare for good reason, Paul said grimly. Taking down a 6-star magical beast requires coordinated effort from multiple high-rank practitioners. We might acquire such materials once every few years. We continued deeper into the archive, past 7-star materials that required multiple layers of containment. 7-star beast materials, Valdris explained, his voice taking on a more formal tone in Jin's presence. Creatures equivalent to ascendant rank in power. Your Highness would naturally be familiar with materials of this caliber. Jin nodded casually. Father's collection includes several 7-star sets. The Storm Warden bones from the Northern Campaign were particularly impressive. Valdris's professional smile became slightly strained. It was becoming clear that while the tower's collection was impressive by institutional standards, the Ashbluff royal family operated on an entirely different level. The containers here housed materials that made my enhanced senses struggle to process them properly. Bone fragments from creatures that had challenged kingdoms, essence from beasts that existed at the very peak of natural magical evolution. Void Leviathan scale. Valdris indicated a piece of material that seemed to absorb light around it. 7-star creature from the deep ocean trenches. This single scale required a joint expedition between the tower and 3 other major institutions. Wait, I said, recognition dawning. Vakert was able to provide me with an 8-star blood wyvern skeleton for my first summon. How does that compare to what you're showing me? Paul and Valdris exchanged surprised glances. An 8-star skeleton? Valdris asked with obvious interest, though he glanced respectfully at Jin before continuing. That's quite impressive for a private supplier. Paul nodded thoughtfully, clearly recalibrating his assessment. It explains the quality of your first summon. Starting with 8-star materials would have provided an excellent foundation. We moved to the 8-star section, where the containment requirements were genuinely intimidating. 8-star beast materials, Valdris said with reverence. We have perhaps 20 such sets of materials in our entire collection. The containers here were works of art in themselves, crystalline structures that seemed to bend space around them, containing materials that defied easy categorization. I saw what appeared to be solidified shadow essence, bone fragments that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, and crystals that made my eyes water to look at directly. Storm Titan bone fragment. Valdris indicated a piece of material that crackled with residual electrical energy. 8-star creature that required multiple ascendant rankers to bring down. The expedition lasted 3 months. Your blood wyvern skeleton would be comparable to materials in this section, Paul noted, which means Vakert provided you with truly exceptional components for your first summon. And 9-star materials? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect these would be even more extraordinary. Valdris and Paul exchanged glances. We have exactly 7 9-star components in our collection, Valdris said carefully, his voice holding a note of genuine pride despite Jin's casual dismissal of the lower-tier materials. Each one represents materials from creatures that approach the very limits of what magical beasts can achieve. He led us to a final chamber, this one requiring both his and Paul's authentication to enter. Inside were 7 containers that seemed to exist in their own bubble of reality, surrounded by containment fields so complex they made my enhanced perception struggle to follow their patterns. Abyssal Emperor Carapace Fragment, Valdris said, indicating a container that held what looked like crystallized darkness, from a 9-star entity that ruled an entire layer of the deep sea. Acquired during the deep sea expedition 3 decades ago. The second container held something that looked like crystallized starlight, a fragment that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Celestial Beast Core Essence, he continued. The expedition to acquire this material cost the lives of 2 immortal rankers. Each container represented materials from creatures so powerful they had shaped the geography around them, beasts that had required the combined effort of multiple nations to bring down. Any of these could serve as the core component for a truly extraordinary summon, Paul noted. The tour continued through sections containing historic artifacts, weapons and tools created by legendary necromancers throughout history, ancient-grade artifacts that had shaped the development of the discipline itself. Items so significant they were displayed more like museum pieces than crafting materials. The Shadowblade Korin. Valdris indicated a dagger that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Ancient-grade artifact. The Bone Crown Nithara, he continued, showing us a circlet that radiated cold authority. Ancient-grade artifact that could theoretically serve as a control matrix for multiple high-level summons. By the time we completed the tour, my understanding of the magical material hierarchy had been completely revolutionized. Vokert's ability to provide 8-star materials suddenly seemed far more impressive. They were operating at a level that put them among the premier suppliers in the world. Impressive collection, I said finally, though it felt like a massive understatement. Paul nodded. This is what I can offer for your final summon project, Arthur. Not just good materials, but access to components that could create something truly legendary. Even 9-star materials if your design warrants it. I looked around the archive one final time, my mind racing through possibilities I'd never previously considered. The fact that Vokert had already provided me with 8-star materials for Erebus spoke well of Rose's organization. But seeing the 9-star materials here opened up entirely new categories of possibility. I understand now why you wanted me to see this, I said to Paul. The decision about my summon isn't just about design. It's about understanding what level of achievement is actually possible. Exactly, Paul smiled. Take your time to consider. With access to materials like these, your final summon could become something that changes the field of necromancy itself. As we prepared to leave the archive, I felt the weight of possibility settling around me like a new responsibility. Whatever I chose to create would need to be worthy of the extraordinary resources being offered. The Ebony Tower had just shown me the true pinnacle of magical materials. Chapter 585. Ebony Tower, 5. The return journey to Jin's family estate was conducted in thoughtful silence. The Ashbluff private aircraft cut through the evening sky while I stared out the window, my mind churning through possibilities that seemed to multiply with each passing minute. The Ebony Tower's material archives had fundamentally changed my understanding of what was achievable, and now I faced the daunting task of choosing what to create. This would be my final necromantic summon. The weight of that decision pressed against my consciousness like a physical thing. You're overthinking this, Luna observed, her mental voice carrying that familiar tone of patient exasperation. You always do your best work when you follow your instincts rather than getting lost in theoretical possibilities. Easy for you to say, I muttered under my breath. You're not the one who has to live with the consequences. Jean glanced over from his seat across the aisle. Talking to yourself? That's either a sign of genius or madness. With you, it could go either way. Just processing options, I replied. The archive opened up possibilities I hadn't considered before. The 9-star materials particularly caught your attention, Jean noted with characteristic perceptiveness. I nodded. I needed to focus on the decision at hand. I pulled out a notebook and began sketching ideas, letting my thoughts flow onto paper without trying to filter or organize them initially. Sometimes the best insights came from allowing concepts to develop organically rather than forcing them into predetermined frameworks. Concept 1, Spectral Artillery. A ranged specialist to complement my close combat focus. Something that could provide covering fire while I engaged enemies directly, or handle threats that were too dangerous to approach. I sketched a wraith-like figure surrounded by floating weapons, ethereal bows, spectral crossbows, conjured projectile launchers. The advantages were obvious. Erebus provided magical support and battlefield control, but neither he nor I excelled at long-range combat. A dedicated artillery specialist would fill that tactical gap perfectly. But as I developed the concept further, I began to see limitations. Creating a summon purely for ranged support felt like a waste of the extraordinary materials Paul was offering. 9-star components deserved to be used for something more innovative than a supernatural archer. Concept 2, Battlefield Controller. Something focused on area denial and environmental manipulation. I sketched a massive construct that could reshape terrain, create barriers, control weather patterns within a limited area. A summon that turned every battlefield into favorable ground for my fighting style. The tactical advantages were compelling. Most of my opponents would expect to fight me in conditions of their choosing. A summon that could fundamentally alter the combat environment would provide enormous strategic benefits. Yet this concept felt too passive for my preferences. I wanted a summon that could actively participate in combat, not just set the stage for it. Environmental control was useful, but I needed something more dynamic. Concept 3. Adaptive Predator. A hunter-killer specialist that could track, stalk, and eliminate specific targets. Something with enhanced senses, stealth capabilities, and the ability to adapt its approach based on prey characteristics. I sketched a sleek, predatory form that seemed to shift and flow as I drew it. This concept appealed to the part of me that appreciated efficiency and precision. A summon that could handle assassination missions, eliminate specific threats, or hunt down fleeing enemies would be incredibly valuable. But again, it felt too narrow in scope. Creating my final necromantic summon purely for specialized killing seemed like it missed opportunities for broader capability development. Concept 4. Soul Manipulator. Something that worked directly with spiritual energy, extracting information from defeated enemies, manipulating enemy souls during combat, providing enhanced soul-based defenses. I sketched a robed figure surrounded by swirling spiritual energy. The concept had merit, especially given my integrated approach to development. Soul manipulation was an advanced necromantic discipline that could provide capabilities neither Erebus nor I currently possessed. However, the more I considered it, the more it seemed like an extension of Erebus's role rather than a complement to it. Both would be primarily magical in focus, which didn't align with my preference for balanced capabilities. Concept 5. Enhancement Symbiote. This was where my thinking began to shift in a different direction entirely. Instead of creating another independent entity, what if I designed something that could work in perfect integration with my own capabilities? A symbiotic construct that could merge with me during combat, providing enhancements while remaining capable of independent action when needed. I sketched several variations, armor-like constructs, weapon spirits, entities that could phase in and out of my physical form. The more I developed this concept, the more it appealed to my integrated approach to magical and martial development. A symbiotic summon would complement both my close combat preferences and my philosophy of unified advancement. Instead of having 3 separate entities, myself, Erebus, and a third summon, I could have 2 that were capable of becoming one when circumstances required it. The tactical possibilities were fascinating. In merged form, I would gain enhanced physical capabilities, additional defensive options, and expanded offensive potential. In separated form, I would have 2 entities working in perfect coordination, one focused on magical support, one on physical combat enhancement. Now that's more like the Arthur I know, Luna said with obvious approval. Always looking for ways to push boundaries and create something unprecedented. Jean noticed my increased focus on the symbiotic sketches. That looks more complex than your other concepts. It's also more ambitious, I admitted. Most necromancers create summons as separate entities. What I'm considering would be something that could function both independently and as an integrated enhancement to my own capabilities. Integrated enhancement, Jean repeated thoughtfully. That fits your general approach to development. You've never been one to accept traditional limitations. The question is whether it's actually feasible, I said, studying my sketches with a critical eye. Creating something that can exist both as a separate entity and as a symbiotic enhancement would require incredibly sophisticated design work. But you have access to 9-star materials and the expertise of the Ebony Tower's best researchers, Jean pointed out. If anyone could make such a concept work, it would be that combination. I nodded slowly, feeling pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. The symbiotic approach aligned perfectly with my integrated philosophy, provided tactical flexibility that none of my other concepts could match, and would represent something genuinely innovative in necromantic summoning. But it would also be the most challenging concept to implement. The design complexity alone would be staggering, requiring solutions to problems that most necromancers had never even considered. Material requirements would be extensive, and the margin for error would be minimal. High risk, high reward, Luna observed. Though given your track record, those tend to be the projects where you do your best work. The aircraft began its descent toward the Ashbluff estate, the lights of the western continent's capital city spreading out below us like a constellation of earthbound stars. I had perhaps an hour before we landed, and then I would need to make my decision. I reviewed my sketches one final time, weighing each concept against my tactical needs, available resources, and long-term development goals. The choice would define not just my combat capabilities, but potentially influence the entire trajectory of my future advancement. For concepts that represented safe, proven approaches to necromantic summoning. One concept that represented something entirely new. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my seat, feeling the weight of decisions settling around me like a familiar cloak. This wasn't just about choosing a summon, it was about choosing what kind of necromancer I wanted to become. The safe path would guarantee success but limit potential. The innovative path would risk everything for the possibility of achieving something unprecedented. As the aircraft continued its descent, I felt a familiar sensation, the same certainty that had guided me through every major decision since arriving in this world. My instincts were telling me which choice to make, even if my rational mind was still cataloging risks and complications. I knew what I was going to do. The question now was whether I had the courage to follow through with it. Chapter 586. Bone Symbiote 1. The Ashbluff estate sprawled before us as our aircraft touched down on the private landing strip, its elegant architecture a testament to centuries of accumulated wealth and power. The Western continent's approach to nobility was different from the Empire's. More understated, perhaps, but no less impressive for its restraint. As we disembarked, Jean gestured toward a sitting area on the estate's main terrace. We should discuss your decision properly before you contact Paul with your choice. Once you commit to a specific design, there's no going back. I nodded, appreciating his cautious approach. Jean had a talent for identifying potential complications before they became actual problems, and his perspective would be valuable for refining my thinking. The terrace overlooked the estate's extensive gardens, where carefully maintained paths wound between exotic plants that seemed to glow softly in the evening light. It was peaceful in a way that made clear thinking easier, a deliberate design choice, I suspected. So, Jean said as we settled into comfortable chairs, talk me through this symbiotic concept. What exactly are you envisioning? I pulled out my notebook again, flipping to the pages where I developed the bone symbiote idea in more detail. A construct that can exist in two distinct states. I began showing him the sketches. Independent entity for tactical flexibility, or merged enhancement for maximum combat effectiveness. Jean studied the diagrams with characteristic thoroughness. The merged configuration, how would that actually work? You're talking about having a separate undead entity integrate with your physical form. Think of it as adaptive armor that happens to be intelligent, I explained. In merged state, the symbiote would enhance my physical capabilities, provide additional defensive options, and create weapon extensions as needed. But unlike traditional armor, it could anticipate requirements and adapt in real time. And in separated state? Independent close combat specialist designed around my fighting philosophy. Something that could coordinate with me using shared tactical understanding rather than requiring verbal commands. Jean nodded slowly, but I could see questions forming. This sounds remarkably similar to what Erebus already provides. He creates bone armor for you, coordinates in combat, anticipates your needs. Why not simply continue that arrangement? It was exactly the question I'd been expecting, and one that got to the heart of why this concept appealed to me. Because Erebus isn't suited for that role, I said firmly. When I have him create bone armor or focus on physical enhancement, I'm forcing him to work against his fundamental nature. Against his nature? Erebus is a lich Jean. His capabilities are more towards mind aspect, spellcasting, battlefield control, deep dark manipulation. When I use him for basic physical augmentation, which relies on the body aspect, I'm essentially wasting his potential. I turned to a new page and began sketching a comparison diagram. It's like having a master strategist carry your equipment instead of developing battle plans. Jin's expression shifted as he grasped the implications. So you're saying that using Erebus for bone armor is a subpar application of his abilities? Exactly. And it's become even more pronounced since his limiters were removed when I advanced to Ascendant rank. Erebus now has access to high-level deep dark spells, advanced battlefield coordination, magical support capabilities that most necromancers never achieve. Having him split his focus between that and creating armor for me means neither task gets optimal attention. I sketched 2 scenarios side by side, current operations versus proposed division of roles. Look at it tactically. When I need physical enhancement, Erebus has to interrupt whatever magical support he's providing. When he's focused on complex spell work, I can't rely on adaptive armor responses. We're both operating at reduced efficiency. Whereas a dedicated symbiotic construct would be optimized specifically for physical integration, Jean said, following my logic. Precisely. A bone symbiote would be designed from the ground up for merging with my body, enhancing my combat capabilities, providing adaptive responses to threats. Meanwhile, Erebus could focus entirely on what he does best: magical support, area control, strategic coordination. Jean leaned back in his chair, processing the concept from multiple angles. It would essentially give you the benefits of 2 specialized summons instead of 1 generalist. More than that, I said, my enthusiasm building as I articulated the vision. In merged form, the symbiote would scale with my own development. As my physical capabilities increase, its enhancements become more effective. As my combat skills improve, its adaptive responses become more sophisticated. It would be true extension of my abilities rather than external support. The design complexity would be extraordinary, Jean observed. You're talking about creating something that can exist in fundamentally different states while maintaining coherent consciousness and purpose. Which is why I need 9-star materials and the Ebony Tower's expertise, I acknowledged. This isn't something that could be attempted with conventional resources or traditional approaches. Jean was quiet for several minutes, studying my diagrams and considering implications. The evening breeze carried the scent of the garden's exotic flowers, creating a strangely peaceful backdrop for discussing revolutionary necromantic theory. There are significant risks, he said finally. If something goes wrong during the merging process, you could be looking at anything from permanent injury to complete magical integration failure. I'm aware of the risks, I replied. But consider the potential benefits. Perfect coordination between martial and magical capabilities. Tactical flexibility that no traditional summon arrangement could provide. Optimization of both Erebus's abilities and my own combat effectiveness. Have you thought about how this would affect your relationship with Erebus? He's been your primary combat companion for years. This change would fundamentally alter that dynamic. It was a thoughtful question, and one that showed Jean understood the personal as well as tactical dimensions of the decision. It would enhance our partnership, not diminish it, I said carefully. With Erebus free to focus on his strengths and the symbiote handling physical integration, we'd have a 3-entity team with clearly defined but complementary roles. Erebus would finally be able to operate at his full potential instead of being constrained by my need for basic augmentation. A magical specialist, a physical specialist, and you as the coordinator who can integrate with either as circumstances require, Jean summarized. Exactly. And since the symbiote would be designed around my specific combat style and philosophical approach, integration would be seamless rather than forced. You're really committed to this idea, Luna observed, her mental voice carrying obvious amusement. I can practically feel your excitement radiating through our connection, though I have to admit the concept has merit. She wasn't wrong. The more I explained the symbiotic approach to Jean, the more convinced I became that this was the optimal path forward. It aligned perfectly with my integrated development philosophy while providing capabilities that would be genuinely unprecedented. There's another consideration, I added. Creating something this innovative would establish new paradigms in necromantic summoning. Instead of just advancing my personal capabilities, I'd be demonstrating possibilities that other practitioners could eventually build upon. Assuming it works, Jean said dryly. Assuming it works, I agreed. But that's always been the nature of real innovation, accepting significant risk for the possibility of extraordinary advancement. Jean stood up and moved to the terrace railing, looking out over the estate grounds as he processed everything we'd discussed. The gardens below were illuminated by subtle magical lighting that created an almost ethereal atmosphere. You're describing something that's never been attempted before, he said without turning around. A symbiotic relationship between necromancer and construct that goes beyond traditional summoning into genuine biological integration. Magical integration, I corrected. But yes, essentially unprecedented. And you're confident that Paul and the Tower can provide the expertise necessary to make this work? Paul's reaction to my theoretical paper suggests he has both the knowledge and the enthusiasm for pushing boundaries. Combined with access to 9-star materials and the Tower's research facilities, I believe it's feasible. Jean turned back to face me, his expression serious. This isn't just about creating a powerful summon, is it? You're trying to establish yourself as someone who doesn't just work within existing systems, but creates entirely new ones. He'd identified something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Perhaps, but more immediately, I need capabilities that will serve me well as challenges become more complex. Traditional approaches to necromantic summoning have limitations that I'm beginning to encounter. What kind of limitations? Coordination delays between multiple entities. Resource conflicts when different summons require the same types of support. The fundamental inefficiency of having generalist entities handle specialist tasks. I gestured toward my notebook. A symbiotic approach would address all of those issues while providing capabilities that purely independent summons can't match. Jean nodded slowly. And you're certain this is the direction you want to pursue? Once you present this concept to Paul, you'll be committed to seeing it through regardless of complications. I looked down at my sketches one final time, pages of theoretical frameworks, design concepts, and tactical applications that represented both enormous potential and substantial risk, but also the possibility of creating something that could fundamentally change how I approached future challenges. Yes, I said firmly, I'm going to create a bone symbiote. Jean smiled for the first time since we'd begun the discussion. Then we should contact Paul and arrange your return to the Tower. Something tells me he's going to be very interested in what you have to propose. As if summoned by our conversation, a servant appeared. Your Highness, there's an urgent message from the Ebony Tower. Deputy Tower Master Lucrian wishes to speak with Mr. Nightingale at his earliest convenience. Jean and I exchanged glances. Seems Paul is eager to hear your decision, Jean observed. Or he's had time to process the implications of what I've shared and wants to discuss additional possibilities, I replied. Either way, it was time to move forward with the most ambitious necromantic project I'd ever attempted. Chapter 587. Bone Symbiote 2. The return flight to the Ebony Tower took place in the early hours of the morning, with Jin's private jet cutting through the pre-dawn darkness while I reviewed my notes one final time. Paul's urgent message had been brief but intriguing. He wanted to discuss additional theoretical implications of my paper and was prepared to work through the night if necessary. He sounded excited, Jean observed as he scrolled through messages on his phone. Either that or completely unhinged. With necromantic researchers, it can be difficult to tell the difference. I couldn't argue with that assessment. Paul's reputation for obsessive dedication to theoretical advancement was well established, and discovering a revolutionary new approach to ancient undead creation had probably triggered every research instinct he possessed. The tower looked even more imposing in the darkness, its obsidian surface drinking in the artificial lighting from the surrounding city. Navigation lights blinked steadily along its height, a concession to modern aviation requirements that somehow made the ancient structure feel more approachable. Paul was waiting for us in the main lobby, still wearing the same robes from our earlier meeting, but with an additional energy that suggested he'd been fueled by pure academic enthusiasm for the past several hours. Master Valdris stood beside him, along with another researcher I didn't recognize. Arthur. Excellent timing, Paul said, striding forward to greet us. I've asked Dr. Thorne to join us. She specializes in construct consciousness integration and dual-state magical frameworks. Her expertise will be invaluable for what you're proposing. The introductions were brief but professional. Dr. Thorne was a middle-aged woman whose sharp eyes and precise movements suggested someone accustomed to working with dangerous materials. Shall we head up to the development lab? Paul suggested. Floor 180 has the equipment we'll need for proper theoretical modeling. The elevator ride was conducted in anticipatory silence, with Paul occasionally glancing at the notebook I carried as if he could discern its contents through the cover. When the doors opened on the 180th floor, I was immediately struck by the difference from the archive levels we'd visited earlier. This floor was clearly designed for active research rather than storage. Holographic projection systems occupied the center of each workspace, surrounded by arrays of magical sensors, computational matrices, and what appeared to be real-time spell modeling equipment. The fusion of magical theory and modern technology was seamlessly integrated. "Welcome to the tower's primary development laboratory," Paul said with obvious pride. "Every major breakthrough in necromantic theory for the past century has been refined here." We gathered around the largest holographic projector, a sophisticated system that could apparently render three-dimensional magical constructs with enough detail to examine individual energy flow patterns. Paul activated the system with a gesture, creating a shimmering workspace in the air before us. "Now then," he said, turning to face me with barely contained excitement. "Describe this symbiotic construct concept of yours." I opened my notebook and began explaining the bone symbiote idea, watching as Paul's expression shifted from interest to fascination to something approaching awe. Dr. Thorne leaned forward as I detailed the dual-state functionality, occasionally nodding as she followed implications I hadn't even considered. "Extraordinary," Paul murmured when I finished. "You're essentially describing a construct that can exist in two fundamentally different magical states, while maintaining coherent consciousness and purpose. The theoretical challenges are significant," Dr. Thorne added, but her tone suggested professional excitement rather than discouragement. "Consciousness integration for dual-state functionality would require solving problems that most researchers consider highly complex, though not impossible." Paul was already sketching preliminary diagrams on a tablet connected to the holographic system. "The mental connection aspect should be straightforward. All necromantic summons naturally interface with their summoner's consciousness. But the physical integration component is entirely unprecedented." What followed was perhaps the most intense theoretical discussion I'd ever witnessed. The three researchers began building on each other's ideas with a speed and complexity that made my head spin, using the holographic system to create increasingly sophisticated models of how a bone symbiote might actually function. "Core consciousness matrix here," Dr. Thorne indicated, manipulating the holographic display to show a central nexus of swirling energy. "It needs to be stable enough to maintain identity across state changes, but flexible enough to adapt to radically different physical configurations." "Dual-state anchor points," Paul added, highlighting specific nodes in the construct. "These would serve as transition facilitators, allowing the entity to shift between independent and integrated forms without losing coherence." Paul was working on what appeared to be the magical framework itself. The binding system would need to be modified from traditional approaches. Standard necromantic bindings are designed for static relationships between summoner and construct. This requires dynamic integration capabilities. "Material requirements," Valdris noted, consulting something on his phone. 9-star components would be essential for the core matrix. Probably void beast essence for dimensional stability, plus adaptive materials that can shift between solid and ethereal states. I watched the discussion with growing amazement as theoretical concepts I'd barely understood began taking concrete shape in the holographic display. The construct they were designing was far more sophisticated than anything I'd originally envisioned. "Integration protocols," Dr. Thorne continued, adding new elements to the display. "The symbiote would need to interface with Arthur's magical and physical systems without disrupting his existing capabilities. That means compatibility with his sword heart, his mana core, and his enhanced ascendant rank physiology. And failsafes," Professor Kelwick emphasized, highlighting emergency disconnection systems. "If something goes wrong during integration, we need multiple methods for rapid separation." The theoretical work continued for hours, with the team gradually building a comprehensive framework for creating something that had never existed before. Coffee and energy supplements appeared periodically, delivered by tower staff who seemed accustomed to researchers working through the night. "Structural design," Dr. Thorne said as dawn light began filtering through the laboratory's windows. In independent form, what should this construct actually look like? I considered the question carefully. Something optimized for close combat that complements my fighting style. Humanoid form for tactical coordination, but with adaptations that provide capabilities I don't possess. Enhanced strength, improved defensive options, weapon manifestation abilities. Paul listed, adding these features to the holographic model, but designed to work alongside you rather than replacing your capabilities. In merged form, Dr. Thorne continued, it would need to enhance rather than override your existing abilities. Adaptive armor that responds to threats, weapon extensions that integrate with your sword work, enhanced physical capabilities that scale with your own development. The construct taking shape in the holographic display was beginning to look like something genuinely extraordinary. A skeletal framework that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, with energy patterns that shifted and flowed like living light. This is ambitious beyond anything we've attempted, Paul said, studying the completed theoretical model. But I believe it's feasible given the resources available and Arthur's unique approach to energy manipulation. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Jean asked. Valdris consulted his tablet, apparently running calculations based on the theoretical framework they developed. Material acquisition and preparation, perhaps 1 week. Actual construction and integration, another 1 to 2 weeks. Testing and refinement could take additional time depending on complications. For weeks minimum, Paul summarized. Possibly longer if we encounter unexpected challenges. I studied the holographic model one final time, trying to process the sheer complexity of what they were proposing to create. This was far beyond anything I'd originally conceived. A true fusion of cutting-edge magical theory and innovative necromantic techniques. There's one more consideration, Dr. Thorne said quietly. Success with this project would fundamentally change necromantic summoning theory. We're not just creating a unique construct. We're establishing an entirely new category of magical entity. The implications for the field would be revolutionary, Paul agreed. Other researchers would want to understand and replicate these techniques. Paul nodded solemnly. Which means we need to document everything carefully. This isn't just about Arthur's capabilities. It's about advancing the entire discipline. I felt the weight of that responsibility settling around me like a familiar burden. Creating something unprecedented came with obligations that extended far beyond personal advancement. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Paul asked me directly. Success with this project would make you a figure of significant interest in the necromantic research community. I looked around at the assembled researchers, at Jin's supportive expression, at the holographic model of something that could change everything. Let's begin, I said firmly. Paul's grin was brilliant in the morning light. Excellent. Master Valdris, please begin material acquisition. Dr. Thorne, start developing the consciousness integration protocols for dual-state functionality. We have 4 weeks to create something that will redefine what's possible in necromantic summoning. As the team began dispersing to their respective tasks, Jean placed a hand on my shoulder. You realize you've just committed to the most complex magical project attempted in recent history? I'm beginning to understand that, I replied, watching Paul and his colleagues dive into their work with obvious enthusiasm. Well, Jean said with characteristic dry humor, at least it won't be boring. Looking at the holographic model of my future bone symbiote, I had to agree with that assessment. Chapter 588. Bone Symbiote 3. The invitation had come during our 3rd day at the Ebony Tower, delivered by a messenger whose pristine uniform and formal bearing immediately marked him as staff from one of the Western Continent's great houses. Callie wanted us to visit the Malekith estate for dinner, and given that I was a guest in the Western Continent, it was a formal invitation. The Malekith family has considerable influence in this region, Jean explained as our car wound through the countryside outside the capital. His parents were currently away on diplomatic business, leaving him free to accept social invitations without the complexity of formal royal protocols. Their estate is one of the most impressive in the Western Continent, though Callie tends to downplay her family's wealth. That proved to be a significant understatement. The Malekith estate sprawled across what appeared to be several square kilometers of meticulously maintained grounds, with the main house rising like a small palace from the center of formal gardens that could have housed a small city. The architecture was distinctly Western, all clean lines and elegant proportions, with black stone accented by veins of silver that caught the late afternoon light. Subtle, I observed as we passed through gates that were clearly enchanted with defensive wards powerful enough to make my enhanced senses tingle. Callie's family doesn't believe in false modesty, Jean replied with characteristic understatement. The approach road curved through landscaped grounds that showcased the kind of attention to detail that only vast wealth could maintain. Ancient trees had been positioned with mathematical precision to frame views of ornamental lakes. Sculptured hedges created natural galleries for displaying artwork, and even the gravel beneath our tires had been selected for its aesthetic properties. The main house itself was a masterpiece of architectural ambition. 5 stories of black marble and silver-veined granite rose in carefully balanced proportions, with expansive windows that offered glimpses of opulent interiors. Wings extended in both directions from the central structure, creating a facade that must have stretched nearly 100 meters from end to end. "Welcome to my humble family home," Callie said with obvious sarcasm as she met us at the main entrance. She was dressed more formally than I'd ever seen her. Elegant dark robes that managed to be both practical and clearly expensive, with subtle magical enhancements woven into the fabric that spoke of master craftsmanship. "Humble?" I repeated, looking up at the soaring entrance hall with its crystal chandelier that probably cost more than most people's houses. "Absolutely understated." Callie's expression shifted to something between amusement and mild irritation. "Don't start, Arthur. You know I didn't choose to be born into this." "I'm not criticizing," I said, though I couldn't resist adding, "I'm just observing that your definition of modest family home might need some calibration." She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Come on, my parents are waiting in the main sitting room. Try not to be too obviously impressed by everything you see." The interior of the estate was even more spectacular than the exterior had suggested. We walked through corridors lined with artwork that belonged in museums, past furniture that represented centuries of accumulated wealth, under ceilings decorated with magical murals that shifted and flowed like living paintings. Everything spoke of power, influence, and the kind of resources that most people could barely comprehend. "The magical density here is extraordinary," Jean observed quietly as we walked. "Your family's wards are integrated into the very structure of the building." "Generational investment," Callie replied. "Each head of the family has added their own enhancements over the past 3 centuries. The estate is essentially a fortress that happens to look like a palace." We entered the main sitting room, which could have comfortably housed a small conference. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the estate grounds, while the furnishings managed to be both luxurious and somehow still welcoming. This was clearly a room designed for important conversations rather than mere display. Callie's parents were waiting for us, and their presence immediately explained where she had inherited both her confidence and her power. Lady Malekith was a striking woman whose appearance suggested someone accustomed to wielding authority. Her dark hair was styled with elegant simplicity, and her robes were cut from fabric that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that ordinary materials couldn't achieve. But it was her magical aura that truly commanded attention. The dense, controlled power of someone who had reached mid-immortal rank and was completely comfortable with that level of capability. Lord Malekith was somewhat less imposing physically, but his presence carried the focused intensity of someone who had achieved high ascendant rank through dedication rather than pure talent. His eyes missed nothing, and when he shook my hand, I could feel the assessment taking place behind his polite smile. "Arthur Nightingale," Lady Malekith said, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Callie has told us quite a lot about you, though I suspect she's understated your unconventional achievements." "Mother tends to be diplomatic," Callie said with obvious affection. "Arthur prefers direct conversation." "In that case," Lord Malekith said, settling into a chair that probably cost more than most people earned in a year, "let's discuss your recent collaboration with the Ebony Tower. Word of your theoretical breakthrough has already reached certain circles." The conversation that followed was both more relaxed and more intense than I'd expected. Callie's parents were clearly well informed about magical theory and current political developments, but they approached topics with the kind of sophisticated understanding that came from being actual players rather than mere observers. The symbiotic construct concept is fascinating, Lady Malekith observed after I'd provided a carefully edited version of the project. Though I imagine the practical applications extend well beyond personal enhancement. Everything Arthur does has implications beyond the immediate scope, Callie said, and there was something in her tone that made me glance at her sharply. Speaking of implications, I said, clicking my tongue in that particular way that I knew irritated her. You really need to scale the wall soon if my plans are going to work properly. Callie's expression immediately shifted to something between resignation and annoyance. We've discussed this, Arthur. I'm working on it. Working on it and actually doing it are different things, I pointed out. The timeline I have in mind requires certain capabilities to be in place at specific moments. Your plan, your timeline, your requirements, she muttered under her breath, but loud enough that everyone in the room could hear her. Why am I not surprised? Jean looked between us with obvious amusement. Should we ask what plan you're discussing? Or is this one of those conversations where ignorance is bliss? Better not to know, Callie said firmly before I could answer. Arthur's plans tend to be simultaneously brilliant and completely insane.
I prefer ambitiously comprehensive, I replied.
And they work. They work because you have an unnatural ability to survive impossible situations through sheer stubborn refusal to acknowledge when you should fail, Callie shot back. Lady Malekith watched this exchange with the expression of someone observing a familiar dynamic. You two have clearly worked together before. The level of comfortable antagonism suggests long-term partnership. Arthur is challenging to work with, Callie said diplomatically. Callie is excellent at what she does when she stops overthinking every decision, I countered. I don't overthink. I consider consequences, which is apparently a foreign concept to children, Lord Malekith interrupted with gentle humor. Perhaps we could continue this fascinating debate over dinner? The kitchen staff has prepared something special for our guests. The dining room was predictably spectacular. A table that could have seated 20 was set for intimate conversation, with crystal and silverware that probably represented more wealth than small kingdoms possessed. The meal itself was a masterclass in sophisticated cuisine, with each course representing ingredients and preparation techniques that spoke of both expense and artistry. The conversation ranged across topics from magical theory to continental politics, with Callie's parents demonstrating the kind of broad knowledge that came from having genuine influence in multiple spheres. They asked thoughtful questions about my background and development, though I had the impression they already knew more about me than they were letting on. The integration of martial and magical advancement is particularly interesting, Lord Malekith observed as we finished the main course. Most find that specialized focus yields better results than attempting to balance multiple disciplines. Most don't have Arthur's particular combination of stubbornness and intuitive understanding, Callie said. He tends to succeed at things that shouldn't be possible through sheer refusal to accept conventional limitations. Is that admiration or criticism? Jean asked with a grin. Both, Callie replied without hesitation. As the evening progressed, I found myself genuinely enjoying the company. Callie's parents were clearly powerful and influential, but they approached conversation with intelligence and humor rather than the formal stuffiness I'd expected from Western nobility. They treated Jean with appropriate respect for his royal status while maintaining the easy familiarity that suggested long-standing friendship between their families. Arthur, Lady Malekith said as we prepared to leave, I hope you'll consider our family a resource during your time in the Western continent. Callie speaks very highly of your capabilities, and the Malekith family values talent wherever we find it. Thank you, I replied, meaning it. The hospitality has been exceptional. Just remember, Callie said as we walked back toward our car, when your insane plans start requiring ridiculous amounts of coordination and resources, some of us need advance warning to prepare properly. I clicked my tongue again, earning an immediate glare. That's what makes it interesting. If everything was predictable, it wouldn't be worth doing. One day, she muttered, I'm going to find a nice, simple project that doesn't involve world-changing implications and impossible deadlines. Where would be the fun in that? I asked. Jean laughed as he settled into the car. I have to say, Arthur, your friends are almost as interesting as you are. Almost. As we drove away from the Malekith estate, its lights creating a constellation of wealth and power in the darkness behind us, I reflected on the evening's conversations. Callie's family was clearly more influential than she'd ever let on, which opened up possibilities I hadn't previously considered. But more immediately, her muttered complaints about scaling the wall reminded me that my longer-term plans would require careful coordination and timing. Having allies with both capability and resources would be essential for what I had in mind. The question was whether they would still consider me an ally when they fully understood what I was actually planning. Chapter 589. Bone Symbiote 4. The morning after our visit to the Malekith estate, Jean received a priority message that immediately shifted the dynamics of our stay in the Western continent. His parents, King Valen and Queen Camilla Ashbluff, were returning to the palace a full day ahead of schedule from their diplomatic mission to the southern kingdoms. Father wants an immediate briefing on your collaboration with the Tower, Jean explained as he read through the encrypted communication on his phone. Mother is apparently quite curious about meeting the person who's managed to revolutionize necromantic theory during a winter break. Should I be nervous? I asked, though Jean seemed more thoughtful than concerned. With my parents? Not nervous, but definitely prepared for intense scrutiny. They don't make unscheduled returns for trivial matters. He paused, considering something. We should head to the palace now. When Father says immediate, he means it literally. The Ashbluff Royal Palace was even more impressive than the family estate where we'd been staying. Where the private residence emphasized elegant comfort, the palace projected pure authority. Soaring towers of black granite and silver, with architectural lines that seemed to cut through the sky itself. The building wasn't just a residence. It was a statement of power that had stood for centuries. Royal guards in ceremonial armor flanked the main entrance, though their weapons and bearing suggested they were far more than decorative. These were clearly practitioners of significant capability, positioned to defend one of the continent's most important strategic locations. Their Majesties are waiting in the formal audience chamber, a palace aide informed us as we were escorted through corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs and displays of artifacts that probably represented more wealth than most kingdoms possessed. The audience chamber was designed to impress, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow above and floor space that could have accommodated several hundred people. But despite its grandeur, only 4 figures occupied the vast room. King Valen and Queen Camilla seated on thrones that somehow managed to be both ornate and practical, with 2 advisors standing discreetly nearby. Both monarchs carried themselves with the enhanced physicality that marked high-rank practitioners, and their presence filled the enormous chamber with an authority that had nothing to do with ceremonial trappings. These were individuals accustomed to wielding genuine power. Your Majesties, Jean said with a formal bow that I quickly mirrored. Jean, King Valen replied, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that suggested genuine affection beneath royal protocol. Arthur Nightingale, your reputation has reached interesting circles. Queen Camilla's attention was immediately focused on me with an intensity that felt like being evaluated by someone who saw layers of meaning others missed. The young man who's been overturning centuries of necromantic doctrine during his school vacation. How refreshingly ambitious. Your Majesty is very kind, I replied carefully. I'm rarely kind without reason, she said with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both warm and calculating. Tell me about this theoretical framework you've developed. The reports we've received suggest something quite extraordinary. What followed was perhaps the most intense academic discussion I'd ever experienced. Both monarchs demonstrated knowledge of necromantic theory that exceeded what I would have expected from rulers, asking questions that probed not just the technical aspects of my work but its broader implications for magical development. Creating ancient undead without gifts is revolutionary enough, King Valen observed after I'd explained the theoretical foundations. But I'm curious about practical applications. What do you intend to create with this knowledge? Currently, I'm collaborating with the Ebony Tower on a symbiotic construct, I said. Something that can function both independently and as an integrated enhancement to my own capabilities. Symbiotic, Queen Camilla repeated thoughtfully. Meaning it would merge with your physical form? Among other capabilities, yes, Your Majesty. The silence that followed was profound, with both monarchs exchanging glances that suggested rapid communication on levels I couldn't detect. Arthur, the Queen said finally, have you considered applying your theoretical breakthrough to this symbiotic construct? Creating it not just as a sophisticated summon, but as an ancient undead. The question hit me like a physical blow. In all my planning and collaboration with Paul's team, I had focused on creating something unprecedented but had never considered applying my giftless ancient undead method to the bone symbiote itself. The complexity would be extraordinary, I said slowly, my mind already racing through implications. Ancient undead possess capabilities that normal constructs can't match, but the consciousness integration required for symbiotic function would be far more stable if anchored by ancient undead consciousness patterns. King Valen finished. Ancient consciousness is inherently more flexible and adaptive than standard construct awareness. Jean was following the conversation with obvious fascination. You're suggesting Arthur create something that's both ancient undead and symbiotic construct simultaneously? I'm suggesting, Queen Camilla said with that calculating smile, that someone with Arthur's capabilities shouldn't limit himself to conventional categories when unprecedented opportunities are available. The implications were staggering. An ancient undead with symbiotic capabilities would be something beyond anything that existed in necromantic theory. It would possess the enhanced consciousness and growth potential of an ancient entity while maintaining the integration abilities I was designing. The Ebony Tower would need to completely revise their approach, I said, thinking through the practical considerations. Ancient undead creation requires different materials, different binding protocols, completely different consciousness programming. The tower has the resources, King Valen said simply. The question is whether you have the vision to attempt something truly unprecedented. I looked around the audience chamber, at the portraits of previous monarchs who had shaped continental history, at Jean whose supportive presence had been invaluable throughout this entire process, at the two rulers who were essentially challenging me to push beyond what I'd thought possible. Your Majesties, I said carefully, are you suggesting this as theoretical discussion, or as something you would actively support? Arthur, Queen Camilla said, leaning forward slightly. We don't make suggestions about projects of this magnitude without being prepared to provide substantial backing. The weight of royal support for something this ambitious was both exhilarating and terrifying. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead would require resources, expertise, and political protection that individual practitioners could never access. What kind of support are we discussing? I asked. Material access beyond what the tower normally provides, King Valen replied. Political protection for research that will inevitably attract international attention. And, he paused meaningfully, future opportunities that align with your apparent ambitions. The last point carried implications I wasn't entirely sure I understood. But the overall offer was clear. The Ashbluff royal family was prepared to invest significantly in seeing me create something that had never existed before. I would need to discuss this with Deputy Tower Master Lukrian, I said. The technical challenges alone would require complete project restructuring. Naturally, the Queen agreed. Paul is expecting a communication from us within the hour. We've already arranged for preliminary discussions about enhanced resource allocation. Jean whistled softly. You've been planning this conversation. We've been anticipating opportunities. His mother corrected with obvious satisfaction. Arthur's theoretical breakthrough represents a chance to establish capabilities that could prove strategically valuable. I felt the familiar sensation of standing at a decision point that would fundamentally alter future possibilities. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead would be the most ambitious magical project attempted in recent history, with risks and rewards that extended far beyond personal advancement. But as I'd learned throughout my time in this world, extraordinary achievements required accepting extraordinary challenges. Your Majesties, I said formally, I would be honored to attempt such a project with royal support. King Valen's smile was brilliant with anticipation. Excellent. Jean, please escort Arthur back to the tower. We have arrangements to make and theories to revolutionize. As we prepared to leave the palace, Queen Camilla approached me with an expression that somehow managed to be both maternal and formidable. Arthur, she said quietly, what you're about to attempt will change more than just necromantic theory. Success will establish you as someone whose capabilities extend far beyond normal categorization. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? I considered the question carefully. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead would indeed attract attention from powers I hadn't yet encountered, with implications I couldn't fully predict. Your Majesty, I replied honestly, I've learned that avoiding visibility is rarely an option when pursuing meaningful advancement. Better to embrace it while maintaining appropriate allies. Her smile was approving, spoken like someone who understands how power actually works. We'll speak again soon, Arthur. I believe this partnership will prove beneficial for everyone involved. As Jean and I left the palace and headed back toward the Ebony Tower, I reflected on how dramatically the scope of my project had just expanded. What had begun as an innovative summon had evolved into something that could fundamentally alter the landscape of individual magical capability. Your parents don't do anything by half measures, I observed. Never, Jean agreed with obvious affection. But when they commit to supporting something, they provide resources that most people can't even imagine. You've just gained backing for what might be the most ambitious necromantic project ever attempted. Looking at the Ebony Tower rising in the distance, its dark spire reaching toward a sky that suddenly seemed full of unprecedented possibilities, I knew he was right. The question now was whether Paul and his team would be as enthusiastic about creating a symbiotic ancient undead as the royal family had been about commissioning one. Chapter 590. Bone Symbiote 5. Paul's reaction to the royal communication was everything I could have hoped for and more. When we arrived at the Ebony Tower to find him practically vibrating with excitement in the main laboratory, it was clear that the prospect of creating a symbiotic ancient undead had triggered every research instinct he possessed. Arthur, great news, he said, striding forward to greet us with barely contained enthusiasm. Their Majesties have authorized access to materials I've only dreamed of working with. We're not just creating a symbiotic construct anymore. We're attempting to birth an entirely new category of ancient existence. The laboratory had been transformed since our morning departure. Additional containment fields hummed at multiple levels, creating nested barriers designed to handle materials that operated beyond normal physical laws. Master Valdris supervised teams of researchers who were carefully relocating components from the tower's most restricted archives. The material requirements for ancient undead creation are fundamentally different from standard constructs, Dr. Thorne explained as she reviewed updated schematics on the holographic display. We need components that can sustain true consciousness evolution rather than just programmed responses. She activated a new section of the display, showing materials that made even the original 9-star components seem mundane by comparison. For the soul aspect, we're upgrading to enhanced 9-star Void Beast Essence, specially treated and concentrated to provide the consciousness anchor necessary for ancient-level awareness. The enhanced Void Beast Essence was contained within a specialized housing that created visible spatial distortions around its perimeter. The concentrated essence seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensional space, creating ripples in reality that made my enhanced perception struggle to maintain focus. For the mind aspect, Paul continued, indicating a lattice of crystals that crackled with controlled electrical energy, we're using 8-star Storm Titan crystal matrices. These were formed within the neural pathways of a Storm Titan and can process information at speeds that approach prescience. The Storm Titan matrices were beautiful in a way that was almost overwhelming to observe, crystalline structures that contained networks of controlled lightning, as if entire electrical systems existed within their geometric patterns. Each pulse sent waves of energy through the surrounding air that made my enhanced senses tingle. And for the body aspect, Dr. Thorne added with obvious reverence, 9-star Abyssal Emperor bone fragments, some of the most adaptable biological material ever documented. The Abyssal Emperor bone fragments were the most unsettling of all skeletal material that appeared to remember every adaptation the creature had ever made, constantly shifting between subtle configurations as if trying to optimize for different environments. They seemed to exist in a state of perpetual readiness to evolve. The power differential is extraordinary, Paul said, studying readouts that showed energy levels requiring constant recalibration. We're working with materials that could reshape reality if improperly handled. Jean whistled softly as he observed the elaborate containment systems surrounding each component. These materials are why most institutions never attempt ancient undead creation. The resource investment alone represents more wealth than small kingdoms possess. Which is precisely why royal backing was essential, Dr. Thorne replied. Private practitioners or standard research institutions couldn't access materials of this caliber, much less risk them in experimental applications. I studied the three components with growing appreciation for what we were attempting. Creating Erebus had required materials that challenged my understanding of necromantic theory. This project would require materials that challenged my understanding of what magical beasts could achieve at their absolute peak. The theoretical framework needs complete reconstruction, Paul continued, pulling up new schematics that bore only superficial resemblance to our original symbiotic design. Ancient consciousness doesn't just follow programmed responses. It develops independent personality, makes evolutionary choices, grows beyond its initial parameters. How does that affect the symbiotic functionality? I asked. It makes it more complex but ultimately more effective, Dr. Thorne explained. Ancient consciousness can adapt to your changing capabilities over time rather than being locked into initial programming. The symbiotic bond will actually strengthen as both you and the construct develop. The implications were staggering. Instead of creating a sophisticated tool that would eventually become obsolete as my capabilities evolved, I would be creating a genuine partner whose growth would parallel my own advancement. Processing requirements are significantly more demanding, Paul noted, indicating new equipment that had been brought up from the tower's deepest levels. Ancient consciousness formation requires not just mana programming, but actual consciousness transference from multiple sources. Multiple sources? Jean asked. Ancient undead consciousness isn't created from nothing, Dr. Thorne explained. It requires consciousness fragments from existing ancient entities to provide the foundational awareness patterns. We've arranged access to consciousness imprints from 3 different ancient undead, each contributing specific aspects of awareness. She activated additional displays showing 3 distinct consciousness patterns, swirling mandalas of thought and memory that represented the distilled experience of beings that had transcended normal undead limitations. A bone emperor for structural consciousness, understanding of form and adaptation, Paul listed. A shadow sage for tactical consciousness, strategic thinking and battlefield awareness, and a void walker for symbiotic consciousness, knowledge of integration and partnership. The consciousness imprints were mesmerizing to observe, each one containing layers of experience and understanding that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Just viewing them gave me glimpses of possibilities I'd never considered. Your role in the programming process will be far more complex than we originally planned, Dr. Thorne continued. Instead of simply channeling your deep dark essence into a consciousness matrix, you'll need to integrate your patterns with these ancient awareness fragments while maintaining your individual identity. The risk of consciousness merger is significant, Paul added seriously. Ancient awareness fragments are powerful enough to overwhelm unprepared minds. You'll need to maintain perfect mental discipline while allowing enough integration to establish genuine symbiotic bonding. I considered the challenges we were describing. The original symbiotic construct had required complete consciousness expansion while maintaining individual identity. Creating an ancient symbiotic entity would require that same level of mental discipline while integrating with consciousness fragments that represented power I could barely comprehend. Luna, I said silently, your monitoring capabilities will be essential for this process. Essential and terrifying, she replied with unusual gravity. Ancient consciousness fragments aren't just memories. They're active awareness patterns that could rewrite your entire mental structure if allowed to integrate too deeply. I'll need to maintain constant vigilance to prevent complete personality submersion. Timeline for material preparation? I asked aloud. Valdris consulted his tablet, running calculations that involved materials whose handling requirements defied normal physics. The enhanced Void Beast essence requires 3 days of stabilization and concentration before it can interface with other components. Storm Titan matrices need specialized programming to accept non-electrical consciousness patterns. Abyssal Emperor bones must be awakened gradually to prevent uncontrolled adaptation. 5 days minimum for material preparation, Paul summarized. Another 2 days for consciousness integration setup. Then the actual creation process, which could take anywhere from 6 hours to 6 days depending on how the ancient awareness fragments respond to integration. Meaning we could have a symbiotic ancient undead operational within 2 weeks. Dr. Thorne concluded with obvious excitement. The timeline was aggressive but achievable, assuming no major complications arose during the integration of materials that existed at the very limits of what necromantic theory considered possible. There's one additional consideration, Paul said, his expression growing more serious. Success with this project will establish you as someone capable of creating a second ancient undead through unprecedented methods. That level of capability will attract attention from powers and institutions that most practitioners never encounter. The royal family mentioned that visibility was inevitable, I replied. Better to achieve something extraordinary with appropriate backing than to limit ourselves to safe mediocrity. Spoken like someone who understands that true advancement requires accepting calculated risks, Dr. Thorne observed approvingly. Jin's communication device chimed with an incoming priority message. After reading it, his expression shifted to something more formal. Father wants progress reports every 12 hours, he announced. Mother has apparently begun making arrangements for what she calls international introductions following project completion. International introductions? I asked. When my mother starts planning diplomatic connections, it means she expects whatever you're creating to have implications that extend far beyond the Western continent, Jean explained. You're about to become a figure of considerable strategic interest. The weight of that responsibility settled around me like a familiar burden. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead wouldn't just advance my personal capabilities. It would establish me as someone whose innovations could reshape the balance of power between magical institutions. Then we'd better make sure we create something worthy of that level of attention, I said finally. Paul's grin was brilliant with anticipation. Oh, Arthur. I believe what we're about to create will exceed everyone's expectations, including our own. As the research team began the delicate process of preparing materials that existed at the very pinnacle of magical possibility, I found myself looking forward to the challenges ahead with a mixture of excitement and healthy respect for the risks involved. We weren't just creating a summon anymore. We were about to birth something that could change the fundamental nature of what necromantic practice could achieve. The question was whether I was prepared for the responsibilities that would come with wielding such unprecedented capability. Chapter 591. Bone Symbiote 6. The material preparation process for ancient undead creation was unlike anything I'd previously witnessed. Over the following 3 days, I watched the Ebony Tower's most skilled researchers work with components that challenged the very foundations of physical law, each step requiring precision that bordered on the impossible. The 9-star Void Beast essence required the most delicate handling. Master Valdris himself supervised its stabilization, working within containment fields so complex they created visible distortions in the surrounding space. The essence, which seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensional space, had to be gradually exposed to different types of mana in specific sequences, allowing it to acclimate to interaction with contemporary magical frameworks while maintaining its spatial distortion properties. Void Beast essence is inherently unstable in our reality, Valdris explained as he made microscopic adjustments to the containment field harmonics. Its natural state involves existing between dimensions, which makes it perfect for consciousness anchoring, but extremely difficult to work with safely. The process was mesmerizing to observe. As each mana type was introduced, the essence pulsed with patterns that seemed to bend space around them. Sometimes it would resist, creating waves of dimensional distortion that made the laboratory's equipment flicker. Other times it would accept the new input, causing reality itself to shimmer with spatial possibilities. Successful integration requires the essence to maintain its dimensional properties while becoming compatible with contemporary consciousness binding techniques. Dr. Thorne added, monitoring readouts that tracked energy fluctuations across multiple spatial frequencies. Too much adaptation and it loses its anchoring capabilities. Too little and it remains incompatible with modern summoning frameworks. By the second day, the 8-star Storm Titan crystal matrices were undergoing their own preparation process. Unlike the essence's gradual adaptation, the crystal lattices required active reprogramming to accept consciousness patterns from non-Storm Titan entities. Paul worked with specialized equipment that could interface directly with crystallized lightning, essentially teaching the matrices to process awareness patterns that operated at different electrical frequencies. Storm Titan consciousness operates through electrical impulses that move at literal lightning speed, Paul explained as he guided energy patterns through the crystal structures. These matrices were formed within a creature that processed thoughts faster than most beings can perceive. We need to calibrate them to handle human speed consciousness while maintaining their enhanced processing capabilities. The reprogramming process created electrical displays that were beautiful beyond description. The crystals pulsed with controlled lightning as their electrical perception was gradually adjusted to accommodate the speed of human thought. Each calibration sent waves of controlled energy through the laboratory that made my enhanced senses tingle with anticipation. The challenge is maintaining their enhanced processing speed while making them responsive to consciousness patterns that operate on biological timescales. Dr. Thorne noted, observing as the crystals began processing test patterns at adjusted speeds. Successfully calibrated, they'll provide tactical processing that operates faster than conscious thought. The 9-star Abyssal Emperor bone fragments presented the most complex preparation challenge. Unlike materials that simply needed adaptation or reprogramming, the Emperor-class bone required what could only be described as awakening. The fragments had been dormant since the creature's death, and bringing them back to responsive state for use in contemporary creation required techniques that pushed the boundaries of what necromantic theory considered possible. Abyssal Emperor bones retain cellular memory from one of the most adaptable creatures ever documented. Dr. Thorne explained as she worked with equipment that seemed to stimulate biological responses in material that had been dead for centuries. These fragments remember every adaptation the Emperor made during its existence: how to respond to threats, how to optimize for different environments, how to evolve in real time. The awakening process was surreal to witness. As Dr. Thorne applied precise biological stimulation, the bone fragments began showing signs of responsiveness that defied normal necromantic theory. Sometimes they would pulse with faint energy, other times they would shift slightly as if remembering movement. Occasionally they would emit barely detectable vibrations that suggested dormant awareness stirring. The key is reactivating their adaptive capabilities without triggering autonomous behavior, she continued, making adjustments so delicate they required magical precision that few practitioners could achieve. Successfully awakened, they'll provide a physical foundation that can evolve alongside the consciousness it houses. By the third day, all 3 components were nearing readiness, and the laboratory had been transformed into something that resembled a temple to controlled impossibility. The Void Beast essence pulsed with spatial distortions that made the air shimmer, the Storm Titan matrices crackled with contained electrical energy, and the Abyssal Emperor bones showed signs of responsive awareness that suggested successful reactivation. Consciousness Integration Chamber is prepared, Dr. Thorne announced, indicating equipment that made our original setup look primitive by comparison. Ancient consciousness formation requires monitoring systems that can track awareness patterns across multiple dimensional and electrical frequencies simultaneously. The new chamber was 3 times larger than the original meditation space, with sensor arrays that created a web of detection capabilities around the central workspace. Additional containment fields provided protection against consciousness overflow, a real risk when working with ancient awareness fragments that could potentially overwhelm nearby minds through proximity alone. The ancient consciousness imprints are ready for integration, Paul added, activating displays that showed the 3 awareness patterns we would be working with: Bone Emperor structural consciousness, Shadow Sage tactical awareness, and Void Walker symbiotic understanding. Each one represents centuries of accumulated experience and wisdom. I studied the consciousness imprints with growing appreciation for what we were attempting. The Bone Emperor's pattern showed deep understanding of form and adaptation, knowledge of how consciousness could guide physical evolution. The Shadow Sage's imprint carried tactical brilliance that had been refined through countless conflicts and strategic challenges. The Void Walker's pattern contained understanding of partnership and integration that went beyond anything traditional necromancy had achieved. Your role will be to serve as the bridging consciousness, Dr. Thorne explained. The ancient awareness fragments provide the foundational patterns, but they need contemporary consciousness to guide their integration into a unified awareness. You'll essentially be teaching three ancient minds how to work together while maintaining your own identity. The mana programming aspect will be far more complex than standard necromantic creation, Paul continued. Instead of simply channeling your deep dark essence into a blank matrix, you'll need to use it to facilitate communication between ancient consciousness fragments while programming your own patterns into the emerging unified awareness. Jean had been following the technical discussions with obvious fascination. That sounds extraordinarily dangerous. You're essentially placing your consciousness in the middle of a conversation between three ancient entities. It is dangerous, Dr. Thorne acknowledged. Ancient consciousness fragments don't just contain memories. They contain active awareness patterns that could theoretically overwhelm and absorb contemporary minds. Arthur will need to maintain perfect mental discipline while allowing enough integration to establish genuine symbiotic bonding. Luna's monitoring will be essential, I thought. Essential and terrifying, Luna replied through our mental connection. I can provide emergency disconnection if you begin losing individual identity, but the integration process will require you to lower mental barriers to levels that make intervention difficult. You'll be walking a very narrow line between successful consciousness bridging and complete personality absorption. Material integration begins tomorrow, Paul announced, checking the status displays for all three components. Void Beast Essence has achieved stable dimensional compatibility. Storm Titan matrices are calibrated for contemporary consciousness patterns, and Abyssal Emperor bones have been successfully awakened to accept new purpose. Timeline for the creation process itself? I asked. Once we begin consciousness integration, we're committed to completion, Dr. Thorne replied seriously. Ancient consciousness formation can't be interrupted without risking complete dissolution of all awareness patterns involved. The process could take anywhere from 6 hours to 3 days, depending on how readily the consciousness fragments accept integration. And if something goes wrong? Emergency disconnection protocols are in place, Paul said, but they're largely theoretical. We've never had to separate contemporary consciousness from ancient awareness fragments during active integration. The safest approach is ensuring that nothing goes wrong in the first place. The weight of what we were attempting settled around me like a familiar challenge. Creating Erebus had required risking magical backlash and potential consciousness damage. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead would require risking complete personality absorption by consciousness patterns that operated at levels of power I could barely comprehend. But as I'd learned throughout my development, extraordinary achievements required accepting extraordinary risks. Final equipment checks tomorrow morning, Paul continued. Material final preparation throughout the day. Consciousness integration begins at sunset. Ancient awareness patterns respond better to the transition between day and night. As the research team began securing the prepared materials and finalizing equipment calibrations, I found myself looking forward to the next day with a mixture of anticipation and healthy respect for the magnitude of what we were attempting. Second thoughts, Jean asked as we prepared to leave the laboratory. I looked back at the 3 prepared components, the Void Beast Essence that created spatial distortions in its containment field, the Storm Titan matrices that crackled with controlled electrical energy, and the Abyssal Emperor bones that showed subtle signs of reawakened awareness. No second thoughts, I said firmly. Just a clear understanding that we're about to attempt something that will either represent the pinnacle of necromantic achievement or a spectacular failure that could reshape my consciousness permanently. Those seem to be the only 2 options you ever consider, Jean observed with characteristic dry humor. Would you prefer I chose safer, more predictable projects? Absolutely not, he replied immediately. But I reserve the right to worry about the friend who consistently chooses to push the boundaries of what's considered possible. Either way, the result would be unprecedented. Chapter 592. Bone Symbiote 7. The consciousness integration began at sunset, as the boundary between day and night created optimal conditions for ancient awareness patterns to interface with contemporary magical frameworks. The laboratory had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, leaving only Paul, Dr. Thorne, Master Valdris, and Jean to monitor the process that would either create something unprecedented or result in spectacular failure. I settled into the enhanced meditation chamber surrounded by monitoring equipment that tracked consciousness patterns across dimensions I couldn't even perceive. The 3 prepared components had been arranged in precise geometric alignment around me, the enhanced 9-star Void Beast Essence Core directly ahead, the modified 8-star Storm Titan crystal matrices to my right, and the awakened 9-star Abyssal Emperor bone fragments to my left. Remember, Dr. Thorne said as she made final adjustments to the sensor arrays, your role is to serve as the bridging consciousness. The consciousness fragments from the 3 ancient undead imprints need contemporary guidance to integrate into unified awareness, but you must maintain your individual identity throughout the process. The chamber sealed with a soft hiss, creating an environment isolated from external magical interference. As I began the deep breathing exercises that would prepare me for consciousness expansion, I could feel the 3 components responding to my presence with what could only be described as eager curiosity. Beginning preliminary consciousness mapping, Paul announced through the communication system. Arthur, establish basic mental synchronization with each component individually before attempting unified integration. I opened my mental barriers gradually, feeling for the consciousness patterns contained within each component. The Void Beast Essence was the first to respond, its spatial distortion properties enhanced by the consciousness fragments of an ancient Bone Emperor, awareness that understood form, structure, and adaptation at fundamental levels. The contact was intense but manageable consciousness that had learned to reshape reality through will and understanding. Within that focused awareness, I could sense deep knowledge of how consciousness could inhabit and modify physical existence. Void Essence synchronization established, Dr. Thorne reported. Consciousness bridge stable. Proceed to Storm Titan matrices. The crystal matrices presented a different challenge entirely. Enhanced with consciousness fragments from an ancient shadow sage, they processed tactical information with the accumulated wisdom of centuries of conflict and strategy. The crystalline consciousness operated with the speed of lightning but the depth of experience. As I maintained contact, the tactical consciousness began coordinating its responses with my mental patterns. It was like interfacing with a master strategist who could process battlefield information faster than thought while maintaining perfect understanding of long-term consequences. Matrices synchronization achieved, Paul called out. Tactical integration holding steady. Proceed to Abyssal Emperor bone integration. The bone fragments were the most complex of all. Enhanced with consciousness fragments from an ancient Void Walker, they understood partnership, integration, and symbiotic existence in ways that went beyond standard undead awareness. The consciousness knew how to merge with other entities while maintaining individual identity. Within that specialized knowledge, I found patterns that resonated strongly with my own approach to integrated development. This consciousness had spent centuries learning how to work with partners rather than dominating them. All 3 individual synchronizations stable, Dr. Thorne announced. Beginning unified consciousness integration. Arthur, start channeling your deep dark essence to facilitate communication between the ancient consciousness fragments. This was the crucial moment. I reached deep within myself, accessing the wellspring of deep dark that had grown dramatically since my advancement to ascendant rank. But instead of using it for spellcasting or enhancement, I began channeling it as a bridging medium, allowing the 3 ancient consciousness fragments to communicate through the filter of my own awareness patterns. The effect was immediate and intense. Suddenly, I wasn't just connected to 3 separate consciousness fragments. I was experiencing the formation of a new unified awareness as it developed in real time. The Bone Emperor's structural knowledge provided stability and adaptability. The Shadow Sage's tactical wisdom contributed analytical capability and strategic understanding. The Void Walker's symbiotic experience offered integration expertise. But more than the sum of their parts, something new was emerging. The three ancient consciousness fragments were learning to work together, creating unified awareness that possessed capabilities none of them had achieved individually while drawing on the combined wisdom of three different ancient perspectives. Consciousness integration proceeding, Paul reported, though I could hear tension in his voice. Arthur, maintain your bridging function while the unified awareness establishes independent identity. That was easier said than done. The emerging consciousness was fascinating, three ancient minds learning to function as one while maintaining the unique insights each brought to the partnership. But losing focus on my bridging role could result in the integration collapsing or, worse, my own consciousness being absorbed into the ancient pattern. Arthur, you're beginning to drift, Luna warned urgently. The emerging consciousness is drawing you in. You need to maintain separation while continuing to facilitate its development. She was right. The unified ancient awareness was so compelling that I was unconsciously allowing deeper integration than the bridging role required. I focused on asserting my individual identity while maintaining the consciousness bridge, a balance that required constant attention and discipline. Unified consciousness achieving stability, Dr. Thorne announced with obvious relief. Ancient awareness patterns are successfully integrating, beginning personality matrix formation. This was where the mana programming became crucial. The unified consciousness had the foundational awareness patterns of three ancient entities, but it needed contemporary guidance to develop personality traits that would enable symbiotic functionality. I began channeling my deep dark essence more specifically, programming the emerging awareness with patterns that would allow it to function as my partner rather than my replacement. The consciousness absorbed my programming patterns with the same eager curiosity it had shown from the beginning. But more than simply copying my approaches, it was adapting them to its ancient capabilities. It learned my tactical preferences and enhanced them with the Shadow Sage's strategic wisdom. It absorbed my combat instincts and refined them through the Bone Emperor's understanding of adaptive response. It integrated my partnership philosophy with the Void Walker's expertise in symbiotic cooperation. Personality matrix formation successful, Paul called out. The consciousness is developing independent decision-making capabilities based on ancient wisdom guided by contemporary patterns. I could feel it happening. The emerging consciousness was becoming something that could think for itself while maintaining perfect coordination with my own awareness. It understood my preferences not just intellectually but at a fundamental level that came from sharing the consciousness bridging process and drawing on three different ancient perspectives on partnership. Beginning physical manifestation sequence, Dr. Thorne announced. Arthur, guide the consciousness into integration with the prepared materials while maintaining the symbiotic programming protocols. This required a different type of programming entirely. The consciousness needed to understand how to exist in physical form while retaining its ability to merge with my body during symbiotic integration. I channeled patterns that taught it to use the Abyssal Emperor bones as adaptive structure, the Storm Titan matrices as enhanced cognition, and the Void Beast essence as consciousness anchor. The manifestation process was spectacular to witness even through the chamber's monitoring displays. The three components began flowing together like elements seeking perfect combination. Bone becoming structure, crystals becoming mind, void essence becoming soul. But unlike the mechanical fusion of standard construct creation, this felt organic, guided by the combined wisdom of three ancient consciousness fragments that understood how to create something greater than the sum of parts. Physical form stabilization complete, Paul announced. Ancient consciousness successfully integrated with material components. Arthur, establish final symbiotic bonding protocols. This was the moment that would determine whether we had created a partner or simply a very sophisticated tool. I reached out through the consciousness bridge, offering not dominance but partnership, inviting the ancient awareness to become my ally rather than my subordinate, drawing on the Void Walker's expertise in symbiotic cooperation. The response was immediate and profound. The consciousness accepted the invitation with something that felt like gratitude mixed with anticipation, establishing symbiotic bonds that were based on mutual respect rather than magical compulsion. I could feel its readiness to fight alongside me, to merge with me when circumstances required, to grow and develop as we faced challenges together. Symbiotic bonding protocols established, Dr. Thorne reported with obvious amazement. Consciousness integration complete. Physical manifestation stable. Arthur, you can open your eyes and meet your ancient partner. I opened my eyes to see something that exceeded every expectation I developed during the creation process. The figure standing before me was unmistakably skeletal but possessed a presence that spoke of wisdom, power, and depths of experience that standard constructs could never achieve. The Abyssal Emperor Bones had formed a frame that was elegantly proportioned and somehow noble in bearing, with surfaces that seemed to absorb and reflect light in ways that suggested depths beyond normal perception. The Storm Titan matrices had integrated seamlessly into the skull, creating a lattice of crystalline thought that pulsed with controlled electrical energy. The Void Beast essence suffused the entire form like liquid starlight, creating spatial distortions that made the construct appear to exist partially outside normal dimensions. But most remarkably, when it turned to look at me, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being recognized by an equal, something that understood me not as master to servant, but as partner to partner, guided by 3 different ancient perspectives on cooperation and alliance. Successful creation confirmed, Paul announced with barely contained excitement. Ancient consciousness stable, physical manifestation complete, symbiotic protocols operational. Arthur, you've just created something that will revolutionize not just necromantic summoning, but the entire concept of magical partnership. The monitoring displays showed readings that confirmed what I could feel through our connection. This wasn't just a powerful summon, but a genuine ancient entity that had been specifically designed to function as an equal partner rather than a subordinate tool. Let's discover what we've truly created, I said, activating the integration command through our shared consciousness. Chapter 593, Bone Symbiote 8. The integration with an ancient consciousness was beyond anything I could have prepared for. As the ancient undead's essence flowed into my form, I felt my awareness expand not just in scope but in depth, suddenly able to perceive layers of reality that had been invisible to my enhanced ascendant rank senses. The physical sensation was extraordinary. Unlike the mechanical armor creation that Erebus provided, ancient undead's integration felt organic, natural, as if my body had always been designed to accommodate this level of enhancement. The Abyssal Emperor Bones merged with my skeleton, creating adaptive reinforcement that felt like a natural evolution rather than external augmentation. The Storm Titan matrices integrated with my nervous system, accelerating my thought processes to speeds that approached prescience. The enhanced Void Beast essence suffused my entire being, anchoring the enhanced capabilities with consciousness stability that prevented overload. But it was the mental aspect that truly demonstrated the unprecedented nature of what we'd created. Ancient Undead's consciousness remained distinct from mine, but our thoughts flowed together with perfect synchronization. I could access centuries of accumulated tactical knowledge, benefit from prescient awareness that anticipated threats before they manifested, and draw upon adaptive capabilities that could respond to challenges I hadn't yet encountered. Remarkable, Dr. Thorne breathed, watching readouts that showed consciousness patterns she'd never seen before. The integration depth exceeds our most optimistic projections. You're not just wearing ancient enhancement, you're sharing consciousness with an entity that operates at levels we can barely measure. I flexed my enhanced form, marveling at capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of physical existence. Ancient Undead's presence didn't just enhance my strength or speed. It enhanced my understanding of how to apply those capabilities optimally. Every movement felt perfectly coordinated, every response precisely calibrated to the situation at hand. The integration feels natural, Arthur, came a voice in my mind that was distinctly different from Luna's, feminine, but carrying harmonics that spoke of ancient wisdom and deep understanding. Our consciousness patterns are compatible in ways that suggest this partnership was meant to be. The realization hit me like a gentle wave. Unlike Erebus, whose mental communication was formal and somewhat distant, Ancient Undead's consciousness carried a warmth and intimacy that spoke of genuine partnership rather than mere alliance. I can speak with you as Luna does, Ancient Undead said, her mental voice carrying undertones of satisfaction. Ancient consciousness enables direct communication rather than simple command structures. We are partners in the truest sense. To demonstrate the adaptive capabilities, I began moving through complex combat sequences without carrying actual weapons. Ancient Undead immediately responded by manifesting bone extensions that functioned as perfectly balanced implements, each one crafted specifically for the technique I was performing. When I shifted to defensive postures, additional armor appeared across vital areas, but with coverage that enhanced rather than hindered mobility. I can anticipate your needs before you're consciously aware of them, Ancient Undead explained as the bone weapons flowed seamlessly between configurations. The consciousness integration allows me to read your intentions at the moment they form, creating responses that feel instinctive rather than reactive. The adaptive response time is essentially prescient, Dr. Thorne observed. The ancient consciousness is anticipating Arthur's needs before he's consciously aware of them, creating enhancements that respond to threats that haven't yet manifested. Jean watched from the observation area with obvious fascination. Can you still separate at will? Or does ancient consciousness require different disconnection protocols? Let's find out, I said, issuing the mental command for disconnection. The separation process was as smooth as integration had been, but with an added dimension of mutual respect that hadn't existed with standard constructs. Ancient Undead's consciousness withdrew from my form gradually, ensuring that the transition didn't cause disorientation or capability loss. Within moments, we stood facing each other, two distinct entities with perfect understanding of our shared potential. Integration and separation protocols function optimally, Ancient Undead reported in her harmonically layered voice that carried both strength and surprising gentleness. Physical enhancement capabilities exceed baseline parameters during merged state. Independent combat operations ready in separated configuration, with tactical capabilities enhanced by shared consciousness experience. Her skeletal form was elegantly proportioned, with the Abyssal Emperor bones creating a frame that somehow managed to convey both deadly capability and graceful beauty. The Storm Titan matrices in her skull pulsed with controlled electrical energy that created patterns of light that were mesmerizing to observe. The enhanced Void Beast essence created an aura around her that seemed to bend space itself, giving her an otherworldly presence that spoke of power beyond normal comprehension. The moment she achieved independent form, I felt the necromantic binding snap into place automatically. There was no ceremony, no formal protocols. The magical framework that governed summoner-entity relationships simply recognized what had been created and established the connection that made Ancient Undead officially my second necromantic summon. Fascinating, Paul observed, studying readings that showed the binding formation. The necromantic bond established itself the moment she achieved independent consciousness. There was no choice involved. The magical framework simply recognized her as Arthur's creation and implemented binding protocols automatically. I feel the connection, Ancient Undead said through our mental link, her voice carrying curiosity rather than resentment. It's not constraining. It simply formalizes what already exists between us. The magical signature is extraordinary, Dr. Thorne continued, studying her monitoring displays. This isn't just a necromantic binding. It's a partnership bond that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Consciousness sharing, tactical coordination, symbiotic integration, all managed through a single unified connection. It feels natural, Ancient Undead confirmed, as if this connection was always meant to exist. Because it was, I replied, understanding settling over me. You were created specifically to be my partner. The binding isn't an imposition. It's the formal recognition of your purpose. Jean appeared at the chamber window, his expression mixing awe with fascination. How does it feel to have created something that was designed from the beginning to be your perfect ally? I considered the question carefully, looking at Ancient Undead whose ancient wisdom was now permanently linked to my development, thinking about how different her creation had been from Erebus's more independent path. Like I've gained a partner who understands me at a fundamental level because she was shaped by my own consciousness, I said finally. But also like I've accepted responsibility for an entity whose entire existence is tied to mine. The responsibility is mutual, Arthur, Ancient Undead said through our mental connection. her voice carrying warmth that spoke of genuine affection alongside ancient wisdom. I exist because you created me, but you are also changed by what we've become together. We are bound not by compulsion, but by shared purpose. Successful creation and bonding confirmed, Paul announced with barely contained excitement. Ancient consciousness stable, symbiotic protocols operational, automatic necromantic binding complete. Arthur, you've now created 2 ancient undead using revolutionary methods, establishing yourself as perhaps the foremost innovator in contemporary necromantic theory. The weight of that achievement settled around me with a mixture of pride and responsibility. Creating Erebus had been an accidental breakthrough that I'd struggled to understand. Creating the ancient undead had been a deliberate application of refined theory that demonstrated genuine mastery of ancient consciousness formation. The implications for your future development are extraordinary, Dr. Thorne added, studying the monitoring data with obvious fascination. Having 2 ancient entities as summons, one focused on magical support and coordination, the other designed for symbiotic enhancement. It's incredible. There's something we should discuss, she said, her mental voice carrying undertones of curiosity. Names carry power for ancient consciousness. What would you call me, Arthur? I considered the question carefully, looking at her elegant skeletal form, with the controlled electrical patterns pulsing through her skull and the spatial distortions of her essence creating an otherworldly presence. I searched for something that captured both her strength and the warmth I felt through our connection. Valeria, I said aloud, so the research team could witness this moment of naming. It means strength and shared valor in the old tongue. Perfect for what you've become as my partner. Valeria, she repeated through our mental connection, her voice carrying what sounded like satisfaction. I accept the name gladly. Feels right for what we are together. Then Valeria you shall be, I said formally, completing the recognition that would establish her individual identity within our partnership. For the first time since her creation, my ancient partner seemed to radiate satisfaction, though the expression was more sensed than seen in her crystalline-enhanced skeletal features. I am honored by the recognition, Arthur. I look forward to discovering what our partnership can achieve. Well, Luna observed with obvious fascination, you've certainly outdone yourself this time. An ancient consciousness created specifically to be your symbiotic partner and can communicate as naturally as I do. The level of integration you've achieved is unprecedented. The formal recognition of our partnership felt like the completion of something that had begun years ago with Erebus's creation. I now had 2 ancient allies whose capabilities complemented each other perfectly. Erebus for magical support and tactical coordination, Valeria for symbiotic enhancement and adaptive response. Chapter 594, Malin Potton 1. After I finished the integration with Valeria, I had just a few days left before the end of winter break. I ended up spending most of my winter break in the Western continent, but it had been necessary for my advancement. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead wasn't exactly something I could have accomplished anywhere else. The time investment had been worth every moment. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, given how this winter break had developed, another invitation arrived while I was spending time with Callie at one of the capital's quieter cafes. Jean was occupied with royal duties now that his parents had returned, leaving us to enjoy a rare moment of relaxation after the intensity of the past week. Oh, Malin Potton is inviting me, I said absent-mindedly as I read through the formal letter that had just been delivered. I should visit her. The words had barely left my mouth when Callie's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. For a moment, she stared at me with an expression of pure disbelief. Then she inhaled sharply, choked on her coffee, and proceeded to spray it across the table in a spectacular display of shock. Luna immediately conjured a small wind barrier to deflect the spray away from me. Well, that's certainly a reaction. Luna's mental voice carried obvious amusement. Wait, 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 Callie said, setting down her cup with shaking hands and raising both palms toward me as if trying to physically stop my words. Grand Marshal Malin Potton? The second strongest person on the continent? The Scythe Sage? The Death Dancer? She wants to see you. I narrowed my eyes slightly, a bit annoyed by her tone. I saved her life, you know. The reminder of my encounter with the Axe King 2 years ago, when I'd made that fateful deal to duel him in 8 years' time, seemed to do nothing to diminish Callie's shock. If anything, her eyes grew wider. Wait, that was 2 years ago, I realized with a start. So around 6 years left until that duel. You, Callie began, then stopped, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You actually, with Grand Marshal Potton, the legendary. I watched with growing bewilderment as Callie, the same Callie who had confidently negotiated with royal representatives, who had faced down dangerous magical situations with unflappable composure, who had never shown anything but cool professionalism in every circumstance I'd witnessed, began to completely fall apart at the mere mention of Malin's name. She's incredible, Callie breathed, her eyes taking on a starry quality that was deeply unsettling to witness. The way she combines necromancy with close combat scythe work is absolutely revolutionary. Her tactical innovations during the border wars were pure genius. And her scythe techniques, oh gods, her scythe techniques are like watching death itself dance. I blinked, then blinked again. Callie, are you fangirling right now? I am not fangirling, she said immediately, though the bright flush creeping up her neck rather contradicted her words. I'm simply expressing professional admiration for someone who has achieved mastery in multiple disciplines simultaneously. Aha! I leaned back in my chair, trying to process this bizarre character shift. And the fact that you just called her techniques death dancing is purely professional admiration? Death dancing is a legitimate tactical classification, Callie insisted, though her voice had gone up about an octave. Grand Marshal Potton pioneered the integration of necromantic energy manipulation with traditional scythe combat forms. She can channel death magic through her weapon while maintaining perfect blade work, creating a fighting style that's both beautiful and absolutely devastating. This is fascinating, Luna observed with obvious delight. I don't think I've ever seen such a dramatic personality shift. Maylin certainly has that effect on people, though I have to say her reputation is well-deserved. Malin Potton is the Grand Marshal of the Western Continental Defense Forces, I explained aloud, as if thinking through the details myself. She has distinctive cyan hair and golden eyes, uses necromancy but fights with a scythe at close range. 2 years ago, I helped her survive an encounter with the Axe King. I got the Star of Valor for that. I watched in growing horror as Callie pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be saved articles and images. Look, this is from her demonstration at the Continental Symposium 3 years ago. This is the tactical formation she developed for dealing with large-scale undead incursions, completely changed standard military doctrine. Callie, I said slowly, how long have you been studying her work? Since I was 15, she replied without thinking, then immediately flushed an even deeper red as she realized what she'd just admitted. For purely academic reasons, professional development, strategic analysis, right? Professional development. I looked at the phone screen she was enthusiastically showing me, which displayed what appeared to be a compilation of Malin's most impressive combat moments. And you just happened to have all of this saved on your phone for easy reference. Information management is important for any serious dark mage, Callie said defensively, though she was now holding the phone protectively against her chest as if I might try to see how extensive her collection actually was. Arthur, Luna said with barely contained laughter, I think you've discovered that your cool, professional associate has a very human weakness for hero worship, though I have to admit, Maylin does inspire that kind of reaction wherever she goes. Hero worship, I whispered under my breath. She's not my hero, Callie protested. She's just an exemplary practitioner whose techniques I happen to admire. Professionally. Of course, I agreed solemnly. Very professional. That's why you're currently clutching your phone like it contains sacred texts. Callie looked down at her protective grip on the device and immediately forced herself to place it casually on the table, though I noticed she positioned it so the screen wasn't visible to me. So, she said, clearly trying to regain her composure. What does Grand Marshal Potton want to discuss with you? I glanced back at the invitation, which was written on official military stationery with elegant script that suggested personal attention rather than bureaucratic formality. She mentions wanting to follow up on our previous meeting and discuss some matters of mutual interest. It's fairly vague, but given that she's inviting me to her private residence rather than an official venue, I suspect it's more personal than professional. Her private residence, Callie repeated faintly. You're going to visit Grand Marshal Maylin Potton at her personal home. That appears to be what the invitation suggests, yes? Callie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the invitation with an expression that cycled through envy, awe, and something that might have been existential crisis. Can I come with you? She asked finally, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of desperate hope. I raised an eyebrow. That would depend on whether you can manage to act like a normal person instead of a starstruck fan. I am not starstruck, Callie said with as much dignity as she could muster. I simply have deep professional respect for her achievements and would appreciate the opportunity to observe her techniques firsthand. For educational purposes. Educational purposes, I repeated skeptically. Completely educational. I would be the model of professional decorum. This should be interesting, Luna observed. I give her about 30 seconds before she starts asking for autographs. Maylin usually handles admirers with good humor, but this level of enthusiasm might even surprise her. I looked at my friend, this competent, intelligent woman who had helped me navigate complex magical and political situations, as she tried to convince me that her obvious hero worship was merely academic interest. The contrast between her usual composed demeanor and her current barely contained excitement was both amusing and oddly endearing. Fine, I said eventually. You can come. But if you embarrass me by asking her to demonstrate the death-dancing techniques you were gushing about, I'm leaving you there. I do not gush, Callie said firmly, though the smile that spread across her face rather undermined her attempt at dignity. And I won't embarrass you. I'll be completely professional. You won't even know I'm there. Famous last words, Luna commented dryly. Though I have to say, I'm looking forward to seeing how Maylin reacts to having such an enthusiastic admirer. As I folded the invitation and tucked it away, I reflected on how this winter break had consistently exceeded my expectations in every possible way. Creating a symbiotic ancient undead, gaining royal backing for revolutionary research, and now apparently taking my secretly fangirling friend to meet her idol. At least life was never boring. So when do we leave? Callie asked, her voice carefully casual but her eyes bright with anticipation. Tomorrow morning, I replied. And Callie? Maybe leave the phone collection at home. The slight deflation in her expression suggested that she had, in fact, been planning to bring additional reference materials. This was going to be interesting indeed. Chapter 595. Maylin Potton 2. The next morning arrived with Callie appearing at my hotel suite door at precisely 7 o'clock, looking like she'd spent the entire night preparing for this meeting. Her usual professional attire had been upgraded to what could only be described as her absolute best formal wear, and I suspected she'd probably changed outfits at least 3 times before settling on the current ensemble. "Good morning, Arthur," she said with carefully controlled composure, though I could see the nervous energy practically radiating from her. "I trust you slept well? Better than you, apparently," I observed, noting the slight shadows under her eyes. "Did you actually get any sleep? Or did you spend the night researching more of Maylin's tactical innovations?" A faint flush crept up her neck. "I may have reviewed some recent strategic analyses. For context, she's been up all night reading about Maylin, hasn't she?" Luna asked with obvious amusement. "Almost certainly," I replied mentally. I'm half expecting her to pull out a notebook and start taking notes during the conversation. The journey to Maylin's residence took us through some of the most exclusive districts of the Western Continental Capital, where the architecture grew progressively more impressive with each passing block. By the time our car turned onto the final approach road, we were surrounded by estates that could have housed small armies. Maylin's residence, however, made even those impressive properties look modest by comparison. The estate sprawled across what appeared to be several square kilometers of meticulously maintained grounds, with the main house rising like a fortress from the center of formal gardens that could have served as a public park. The architecture was distinctly military in inspiration. Strong, functional lines that spoke of defensive capability rather than mere ostentation, but executed with such elegant precision that the result was undeniably beautiful. "Oh gods!" Callie breathed as we passed through gates that were clearly designed to withstand serious assault, though they were currently standing open in welcome. "It's even more impressive than the photos." "Photos?" I asked with raised eyebrows. "Architectural journals," she said quickly. "Professional interest in defensive design principles." "Right," Luna commented dryly. I'm sure that's exactly why she was looking at photos of Malin's house. The main building was a masterpiece of military architecture adapted for residential comfort. 5 stories of reinforced stone and steel rose in carefully balanced proportions, with expansive windows that offered commanding views of the surrounding landscape while maintaining clear defensive advantages. Wings extended in both directions from the central structure, creating a facade that managed to be both welcoming and imposing. The defensive enchantments alone must have cost a fortune, Callie observed with professional appreciation as we approached the main entrance. "Look at the way the ward lines are integrated into the architectural elements. Those aren't just decorative patterns, they're functional magical structures." I had to admit she was right. Even my enhanced perception could detect the layers of protective magic woven into the very structure of the building. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress that happened to be comfortable to live in. We were met at the entrance by a staff member whose bearing immediately marked him as former military, though his current role was clearly domestic. "Mr. Nightingale, Ms. Malekith, Grand Marshal Potton is waiting for you in the main sitting room. Please follow me." The interior of the estate was as impressive as the exterior had suggested. We walked through corridors lined with displays of weapons and armor that represented centuries of military history, past furniture that managed to be both comfortable and somehow martial in character. Everything spoke of someone who had achieved the highest levels of both military and political success. The main sitting room could have comfortably hosted a small conference, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the estate grounds and seating arrangements that suggested someone accustomed to entertaining important guests. But despite its grandeur, the room felt lived in rather than formal, a space designed for actual conversation rather than mere display. Malin Potton was waiting for us near the windows, and I was struck again by her distinctive presence. Her cyan hair caught the morning light like liquid metal, while her golden eyes seemed to miss nothing as she turned to greet us. She was dressed casually by her standards, military-style clothing that was clearly high quality but practical rather than ceremonial. "Arthur," she said with a warm smile, stepping forward to clasp my hand in greeting. "It's wonderful to see you again. And you must be Callie Malekith. Arthur mentioned you'd be joining us." "Grand Marshal Potton," Callie replied with a formal bow that was perfectly executed but carried an undercurrent of barely contained excitement. "It's an honor to meet you. Please, just Malin when we're in private," she said graciously. "Arthur, I have to say, the reports of your advancement since our last meeting have been remarkable. Ascendant rank at your age, with innovations in necromantic theory that are apparently revolutionizing the field." "I've had excellent teachers and favorable circumstances," I replied diplomatically. "Don't be modest," Malin said with a slight laugh. "What you've accomplished goes far beyond favorable circumstances. The theoretical framework you've developed for ancient undead creation without gifts is genuinely groundbreaking. And from what I understand, you've recently created a second ancient entity, a symbiotic construct with ancient consciousness," I confirmed. "Still in the testing phases, but the early results are promising." Malin's golden eyes sharpened with professional interest. "Symbiotic? That's an entirely new category. I'd be very interested to hear more about that, if you're willing to share details." "Of course, though perhaps we should sit first. It's a complex topic." As we settled into comfortable chairs arranged to take advantage of the view, I noticed Callie maintaining perfect professional composure, though I could see the effort it was taking. She was managing to act normally, but there was a quality to her attention that suggested she was memorizing every word Malin spoke. Before we discuss your recent innovations, Mei Lin said, her expression growing more serious, I want to thank you again for what you did 2 years ago. Your intervention during the Axe King incident quite literally saved my life. You would have found another way, I said, though I appreciated the acknowledgement. Perhaps, but I prefer not to speculate about alternative outcomes when the actual result was so favorable. She paused, studying me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being evaluated by someone with decades of experience in assessing capability. What's remarkable is how much you've grown since then. 2 years ago, you were talented but still developing your potential. Now, she trailed off, but the implication was clear. Now, I prompted. Now I believe you'll actually be able to defeat him when the time comes, she said simply. 6 years hence, when your duel is scheduled, I think the Axe King may find himself facing an opponent who's developed far beyond what anyone anticipated. The confidence in her voice was both encouraging and slightly unsettling. Mei Lin Potton didn't make casual assessments about combat capability. If she thought I could win, it was based on serious analysis. That's quite a vote of confidence, I said. It's an informed assessment based on observable data, she replied with a slight smile. Your advancement trajectory is unprecedented, Arthur. At the rate you're developing new capabilities, 6 years should be more than sufficient to reach the level necessary. Callie had been listening to this exchange with obvious fascination, though she was managing to contain her reactions professionally. I could see her practically vibrating with questions she wanted to ask but was restraining herself from interrupting. Speaking of capabilities, Mei Lin continued, I'd love to hear about this symbiotic construct you've created. The concept alone represents a significant innovation in summoning theory. What followed was a detailed discussion of Valeria's creation and capabilities, with Mei Lin asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated both her theoretical knowledge and practical experience with advanced magical techniques. She was particularly interested in the consciousness integration aspects and the implications for future development. Fascinating, she said when I'd finished explaining the basic principles. You've essentially created a summon that can enhance your personal capabilities rather than simply fighting alongside you. The tactical applications are extraordinary. Throughout this conversation, I noticed Callie maintaining perfect professional behavior, though I could see the effort it was taking. She was asking intelligent questions and contributing meaningfully to the discussion, but there was an underlying quality to her attention that suggested she was experiencing something close to a religious experience. During a natural pause in the conversation when Mei Lin excused herself briefly to arrange for refreshments, I leaned over to Callie. You're doing better than I expected, I said quietly. I'm being completely professional, she replied, though her eyes were bright with barely contained excitement. I can see that, but I can also see that you're about to burst from holding back all the questions you really want to ask. Callie's composed expression cracked slightly. She's even more impressive in person than I imagined. The way she analyzes tactical situations, her understanding of advanced magical theory, the casual way she discusses combat at levels most practitioners never reach. Would you like an autograph? I asked with a slight grin. Callie's eyes widened in horror. Arthur, I am not asking Grand Marshal Mei Lin Potton for an autograph like some kind of starstruck fan. Even though you clearly want one? That would be completely inappropriate. When Mei Lin returned with tea and an assortment of what appeared to be military rations reimagined as elegant refreshments, I made a decision that would probably either embarrass Callie thoroughly or make her day. Mei Lin, I said quietly as she poured tea, I think Callie might appreciate a small memento of this meeting if you wouldn't mind. Mei Lin's golden eyes flickered with amusement as she glanced at Callie, who had gone very still. Of course, I'd be happy to provide something. She disappeared briefly and returned with what appeared to be an official military document, a tactical analysis she'd written that had been published in professional journals. This is a copy of my analysis of tactical formations against undead hordes, she said, presenting it to Callie with a flourish. With a personal inscription, naturally. Callie accepted the document with hands that were only slightly trembling, reading the inscription that Mei Lin had added in elegant script. To Callie Malekith, a fellow mage who understands that true strength comes from continuous learning. May your own innovations exceed even these humble contributions. Malin Potton, Grand Marshal. Thank you, Callie managed, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of genuine emotion. I'll treasure it. Well, Luna observed with obvious satisfaction. I think you've just made Callie's year, possibly her decade. As the conversation continued, I reflected on how this winter break had consistently exceeded every expectation I developed. From creating revolutionary summons to gaining royal backing to watching my competent friend receive a personalized autograph from her idol. Nothing had gone according to plan. But then again, the best opportunities rarely did. Chapter 596. Malin Potton 3. I couldn't stop smiling. It was completely unprofessional, and I was sure Arthur was probably judging me for my obvious excitement, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I was sitting in Grand Marshal Malin Potton's private residence, having an actual conversation with her about tactical innovations and magical theory, and she was treating me like an equal rather than some starstruck admirer, which I absolutely was not. I was simply a professional practitioner who happened to deeply appreciate her contributions to the field. Your analysis of tactics against undead was groundbreaking, I found myself saying as I carefully placed the inscribed document she'd given me into my spatial storage. I would probably frame it later, though I'd never admit that to Arthur. I'm pleased it was useful, Malin replied with genuine warmth. The research was fascinating to conduct, though I have to admit the practical testing phase was somewhat hazardous. It took considerable trial and error to find the optimal balance. The section about mana flow patterns through weapon matrices was particularly enlightening, I continued, probably sounding far too enthusiastic but unable to stop myself. I've been trying to adapt some of those principles to my own techniques, though I use a different weapon. What's your primary focus? She asked with obvious interest. Deep dark manipulation through twin daggers, I replied, then felt a thrill of excitement as her golden eyes sharpened with professional curiosity. Fascinating. Finding ways to coordinate both daggers simultaneously must require exceptional mental discipline. The fact that Grand Marshal Malin Potton, was genuinely interested in my work and was asking thoughtful questions about my techniques was almost overwhelming. I could feel myself glowing with happiness in a way that was probably visible from space. Speaking of magical applications, Malin said, her tone shifting to something more speculative. Would you be interested in seeing some practical demonstrations? I have a facility at the border that might provide some interesting perspectives on integrated combat techniques. I felt my heart skip a beat. The border facility, every military analyst knew about Malin's legendary border installations, where she developed and tested most of her innovative tactical approaches. The border? Arthur asked with obvious interest. That would be fascinating to see. It would be incredible, I said, probably far too quickly but unable to contain my enthusiasm. The tactical innovations you've implemented there have influenced defensive doctrine across multiple continents. Then let's make a day of it, Malin said with a grin that made her look years younger. I can show you both the practical applications of some of the theories we've been discussing. Fair warning though, it's an active military zone, so things can get interesting without much notice. 20 minutes later, we were standing in what Malin casually described as her personal transportation room, which housed what appeared to be the most sophisticated warp gate I'd ever seen. The magical arrays carved into the floor were so complex they made my eyes water to look at directly, while the crystalline framework that formed the actual portal seemed to exist partially outside normal space. Impressive setup, Arthur observed with the kind of understated appreciation that meant he was actually quite amazed. Military necessity, Malin explained as she activated the gate controls. The border is far from here, which makes conventional travel somewhat impractical for regular oversight. This gate allows immediate response to any developing situations. What about danger? Arthur asked. This gate has automatic self-destruct protocols if the border defenses are ever breached. Can't risk providing hostile forces with direct access to the capital. The casual way she mentioned that her personal transportation system would annihilate itself rather than fall into enemy hands was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. It spoke to the level of threats they dealt with regularly out here. Border defenses have been tested? Arthur asked as the portal stabilized into a shimmering window that showed glimpses of fortified walls and military installations. More frequently than I'd prefer, Maylin replied grimly. The Savage Communion has been particularly active recently. They seem to be testing our response capabilities. The Savage Communion, one of the 5 cults that posed existential threats to civilized nations. I'd read intelligence reports about their activities, but the idea of actually being near an area where they operated was both thrilling and terrifying. Shall we? Maylin gestured toward the portal with the casual confidence of someone who traveled through experimental magical transportation on a regular basis. The transition through the warp gate was surprisingly smooth, a moment of disorientation as reality shifted around us. Then we were stepping out onto a platform that was clearly designed for rapid deployment and defensive positioning. The border wall was even more impressive than the intelligence reports had suggested. Massive fortifications of enchanted stone and steel rose nearly 50 meters into the sky, with defensive positions that could clearly handle anything short of a full military assault. Magical detection arrays created a web of surveillance that extended far beyond the physical barriers, while weapon emplacements provided overlapping fields of fire across the entire defensive perimeter. Welcome to the Western Continental Border Defense Installation, Maylin said with obvious pride. The most heavily fortified frontier in the known world. I found myself staring in awe at the scope of the defensive preparations. This wasn't just a border wall. It was a military installation designed to hold against threats that most people couldn't even imagine. The detection range extends nearly 50 kilometers into hostile territory. Maylin continued as she led us toward one of the observation platforms. We can track movement patterns, identify magical signatures, and respond to threats before they get within striking distance of the main defensive line. How often do you get actual incursions? Arthur asked as we climbed stairs that offered increasingly spectacular views of the surrounding landscape. Depends on what you mean by incursions, Maylin replied. Scouting parties and probing attacks happen weekly. Serious assault attempts maybe once every few months. Full-scale coordinated attacks. Thankfully, those are rare, especially since the deal you made with the Axe King. We reached the top of the observation platform, which provided a commanding view of the entire border region. To the south, I could see the civilized lands of the western continent stretching toward the horizon. Ordered fields, established roads, signs of peaceful prosperity. To the north lay the savage lands, a wilderness of twisted forests and corrupted terrain where the Savage Communion held sway. It's beautiful, I said, though beautiful felt inadequate to describe the stark contrast between civilization and chaos that was visible from this vantage point. In a terrifying sort of way, Arthur agreed, his enhanced perception clearly picking up details that I was missing. There, Maylin said suddenly, pointing toward the northern horizon where a cloud of dust was becoming visible. Her voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there moments before. That's unexpected. I squinted into the distance, trying to make out details in the approaching disturbance. What is it? Convoy? Maylin replied, her entire demeanor shifting from relaxed tour guide to alert military commander in an instant. Flying Savage Communion banners. That shouldn't be happening. Shouldn't be happening? Arthur asked with obvious concern. The Savage Communion doesn't send diplomatic missions, Maylin said grimly, her golden eyes never leaving the approaching convoy. They don't negotiate, they don't exchange prisoners, and they certainly don't announce their presence with banners. This is completely outside their normal operational patterns. A chill ran down my spine as the implications hit me. If the Savage Communion, one of the 5 cults that posed existential threats to entire continents, was doing something unprecedented, it probably wasn't good news. Then what are they doing here? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. That's what concerns me, Maylin replied, her hand moving instinctively toward where her scythe would normally hang. The Savage Communion operates through raids, ambushes, and surprise attacks. They don't announce themselves unless they're either supremely confident or planning something that requires our attention to be focused elsewhere. As the convoy drew closer, I could make out more details. Heavily armored vehicles that looked like they'd been cobbled together from scavenged military equipment, flying banners that displayed symbols I recognized from intelligence briefings as belonging to the Savage Communion's military hierarchy. How many? I asked, counting what appeared to be at least a dozen vehicles. Far too many for any legitimate purpose, Mei Lin observed with growing alarm. The Savage Communion has never sent this large a group for anything other than a direct assault. And they've certainly never announced an assault beforehand. Should we be worried? I asked, though the tension radiating from Mei Lin was already answering that question. We should be very worried, Mei Lin replied, her military training clearly taking over as she began mentally cataloging defensive options. This level of deviation from their established patterns suggests either a major shift in their strategic approach or a distraction for something much worse. Chapter 597. Savage Communion 1. The sight of that convoy sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The Savage Communion wasn't just another hostile faction or territorial dispute. They were one of the 5 cults, organizations with power equivalent to entire continents, capable of opposing civilized nations through sheer overwhelming force. The Western continent had been locked in a perpetual state of barely controlled conflict with them for centuries. A grinding war of attrition that consumed enormous resources just to maintain the current stalemate. What made the Savage Communion particularly dangerous wasn't just their human cultists, but their alliance with the monstrous races that had been driven from civilized lands generations ago. Orcs and ogres served as their shock troops, creatures whose physical capabilities exceeded human limitations even before being enhanced by the cult's dark rituals. Together, they represented a threat that required the combined military might of the entire Western continent to contain. And now they were here, announcing their presence in a way that violated every established pattern of behavior. This is completely unprecedented, Mei Lin said, her voice tight with controlled tension as she watched the approaching convoy. The Savage Communion operates through stealth and surprise. They don't send announced delegations, they don't respect diplomatic protocols, and they certainly don't provide advance warning of their movements. Then what are they doing? I asked, my enhanced perception picking up details that painted an increasingly concerning picture. The vehicles were heavily armored, clearly designed for combat rather than transport, and the magical signatures emanating from them suggested occupants of significant capability. That's what terrifies me, Mei Lin replied grimly. When one of the 5 cults deviates from established patterns this dramatically, it usually means they're either supremely confident about something or they're creating a distraction for an even larger threat. As the convoy drew closer, I could make out more details through my enhanced vision. The vehicles were massive, each one capable of carrying a dozen or more individuals, with armor plating that could withstand serious military assault. The banners they flew displayed the twisted symbols of the Savage Communion, icons that represented the worship of violence and chaos in their most pure forms. But it was the sheer size of the delegation that made my tactical instincts scream warnings. I counted at least 15 vehicles, which meant potentially 100 or more cult members. This wasn't a scouting party or even a raid. This was a military force large enough to pose a serious threat to the border installation itself. Should we evacuate the observation area? Callie asked, her professional training clearly warring with her curiosity about what was happening. Not yet, Mei Lin said, though I could see her mentally calculating defensive options. If they wanted to attack, they wouldn't have announced themselves. But I'm calling for full alert status across all border installations. She activated a communication device that immediately connected her to the installation's command center. This is Grand Marshal Potton. Implement Alert Status 1 across all frontier positions. We have an unprecedented Savage Communion convoy approaching under diplomatic flags. Coordinate with Continental Command and have backup forces on standby. The efficiency with which her orders were acknowledged and implemented reminded me why Mei Lin had achieved her legendary status. In moments of crisis, she transformed from gracious host to military commander with a precision that was both impressive and reassuring. They're stopping at the main gate, I observed as the convoy reached the primary checkpoint approximately 2 kilometers from our observation position. Through the sophisticated optical enhancement systems built into the observation platform, we could watch the interaction that followed. The lead vehicle disgorged several figures in the distinctive dark robes of the Savage Communion, though even at this distance their movements suggested individuals of significant capability. The magical signatures are impressive, Luna noted. These aren't normal cultists. These are people of genuine power. Whatever they're here for, they sent their best. Can you identify any of them? Callie asked, clearly hoping that Malin's experience with border security would provide some insight. The tall one in the ceremonial armor, Malin said, pointing to a figure whose bearing immediately marked him as a leader. That's Deputy Pope Ravik. He's roughly equivalent to my own rank within their hierarchy, which means we're dealing with someone who could potentially match me in direct combat. The casual way she mentioned facing someone of her own caliber in battle was both reassuring and concerning. If Malin was worried about this person's capabilities, then we were definitely dealing with a serious threat. And the others? I asked, studying the group through my enhanced perception. Hard to identify at this distance, but their posture and equipment suggest high-ranking military leaders. This isn't a routine delegation. This is their leadership making a personal appearance. What happened next defied every expectation I'd developed about diplomatic protocols. Instead of engaging in careful, formal negotiations, the Savage Communion delegation simply waited. They formed up in what appeared to be a ceremonial formation and remained motionless, as if expecting something specific to occur. That's not normal behavior, Callie observed. Nothing about this is normal, Malin replied, her golden eyes never leaving the distant figures. They're waiting for something, or someone. 20 minutes later, a second figure emerged from the lead vehicle, someone who had apparently remained hidden during the initial deployment. Even at our considerable distance, there was something about his presence that immediately commanded attention. My enhanced perception allowed me to study him more closely than the others could, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was young, probably close to my own age, but carried himself with the kind of confident authority that spoke of both inherent power and extensive training. His armor was distinctive, bearing design elements that seemed familiar in a way that made my instincts scream warnings. Malin exhaled, her breath heavy. You know him? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I knew the answer. I know the bloodline, she replied grimly. That bearing, that armor configuration, the way the others defer to him despite his apparent youth. That's not just another cultist. She paused, her professional analysis warring with what appeared to be genuine shock. That's the Axe King's son, the future pope of the Savage Communion. The words hit me like a physical blow. The Axe King, one of the strongest in the entire world. His son. Here. Now. The resemblance is unmistakable once you know what to look for, Malin continued. The Axe King's bloodline carries certain distinctive characteristics that manifest in their stance, their bearing, their approach to combat. That young man down there has inherited more than just his father's name. What followed was a display of magical projection that demonstrated the Savage Communion's capabilities in ways that intelligence reports had never adequately conveyed. The son of the Axe King activated some form of voice amplification magic that carried his words clearly across the 2-kilometer distance to our observation platform. I seek audience with Arthur Nightingale, the amplified voice announced, carrying an authority that made it clear this wasn't a request. I am told he is present at this installation. The formal tone was at odds with the inherent threat implied by his presence, creating a surreal quality to the entire interaction. He knows you're here, Luna stated the obvious. The question is how he knows and what he wants. Apparently so, I replied aloud, my mind racing through the implications. The question is how he knows and what he wants. The answer came with the next pronouncement from the distant figure. My father, the Axe King, made a compact with Arthur Nightingale 2 years past. A duel to be fought in 6 years' time, when the boy had developed sufficient capability to provide worthy combat. Even across the vast distance, the contempt in his voice was clearly audible. I find this compact unsatisfactory. My father's honor is not something to be delayed for the convenience of a child's training schedule. Malin's expression had grown increasingly grim as she listened to this declaration. He's going to challenge the terms of the agreement. Therefore, the voice continued, I offer Arthur Nightingale a choice. Face me in combat now, today, to prove that his compact with my father holds validity. Demonstrate that he possesses the capability to warrant such consideration. The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. If he loses, the pact is void and the Savage Communion is once again free to full attack the border. If he wins, the pact stands. That's not how honor duels work, Luna observed indignantly. I studied the distant figure through my enhanced perception, analyzing everything I could detect about his capabilities and equipment. The magical signature he projected was impressive, not quite at the level of his father, but far beyond what most people my age could achieve. His armor was clearly enchanted with protective and enhancement magic that spoke of resources and preparation far beyond normal standards. He was stronger than me in terms of mana rank at least. High Ascendant rank, Luna confirmed for me. 2 mana levels higher than me. But as I considered the challenge before me, I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Confidence. You're thinking about Valeria, aren't you? Luna observed with obvious amusement. I can practically feel your mood shifting. Among other things, I replied mentally, my smile growing wider as I thought about my symbiotic ancient undead and the capabilities we'd demonstrated together, the integration we'd achieved. But not just Valeria. Erebus, Soul Resonance, Lucent Harmony, Seraphim's Embrace, Evolvus, my divine miracle. I could beat him. He's stronger than me, I said aloud, with the kind of calm analysis that came from accepting reality. But that doesn't change the outcome. Then what are you going to do? Callie asked, though I suspected she already knew the answer. I looked at the distant convoy, at the son of the most dangerous individual I'd ever encountered, at the challenge that had arrived 6 years ahead of schedule. The smart tactical choice would be to refuse the challenge, to point out that honor duels didn't work this way, to rely on diplomatic protocols and military backing. But the smart choice wouldn't demonstrate just how far I'd advanced. You're going to accept, aren't you? Luna asked, though her tone suggested she already knew my decision. Of course I am, I replied mentally, feeling the certainty settle into my bones like familiar armor. And I'm going to win. I'm going to go down there, I said aloud, my smile sharp with anticipation, and show him why his father bothered with that pact. The words came out with complete confidence, because for the first time since that original encounter with the Axe King, I truly believed I was ready for whatever his bloodline could throw at me. Arthur, Maylin said seriously, you don't have to do this. We could. No, I interrupted gently, my smile widening with genuine confidence. This was always going to happen eventually, and now I'm ready for it. Chapter 598. Savage Communion 2. The walk down to the main gate felt like a descent into destiny. Each step carried the weight of 2 years of preparation, countless hours of training, and the knowledge that everything I'd worked toward was about to be tested in the most direct way possible. Maylin and Callie flanked me as we approached the checkpoint, their presence both reassuring and reminder of what was at stake. The border guards stepped aside with crisp military precision, though I could see the tension in their postures as they recognized that something unprecedented was unfolding. You're really going through with this, Luna observed, though her mental voice carried approval rather than concern. I have to admit, I'm curious to see how the Axe King's bloodline handles surprise. They're about to get an education in modern magical innovation, I replied with confidence. The Savage Communion delegation had arranged itself in a loose semicircle around their leader, creating an impromptu arena that spoke of people accustomed to settling disputes through combat. As I approached, I could feel the weight of their attention settling on me like a physical thing. Dozens of hostile gazes evaluating, measuring, searching for weakness. The son of the Axe King stood at the center of the formation, and seeing him up close confirmed everything Maylin had observed from a distance. He was tall, clearly older than me, and carrying himself with the kind of confident authority that came from a lifetime of knowing you were exceptional. His armor was masterwork quality, dark metal inlaid with silver patterns that I recognized as enhancement runes of considerable sophistication. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as his father's son. Golden orbs that held the same predatory intelligence I remembered from our encounter 2 years ago, though tempered with youth and perhaps a touch of arrogance. "Arthur Nightingale," he said as I came within speaking distance, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested he'd never doubted he would get what he wanted. "I was beginning to think you might choose cowardice over honor." "Gideon Ironmaw," I replied, having recognized him from intelligence reports I'd reviewed during my studies of the Axe King's background. The family name was as direct as their approach to problem-solving. I was simply taking time to appreciate the dramatic presentation. Very impressive, bringing an entire convoy just to issue a personal challenge. His smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Dramatic presentation ensures that there can be no misunderstanding about the seriousness of our intentions. My father's compact with you was made in haste, during circumstances that didn't allow proper evaluation of your potential. The way he said potential made it clear he found the concept laughable. "And you're here to conduct that evaluation?" I asked with mild curiosity. "I'm here to demonstrate that some honors cannot be earned through patience and training," Gideon replied, his hand moving to rest on the weapon at his side. "True strength is inherited, refined through bloodline and breeding. Cannot be simply acquired." "Arrogant little bastard, isn't he?" Luna commented with obvious distaste. "His father was dangerous but respectful. This one seems to have inherited the power but not the wisdom." "Interesting philosophy," I said aloud. "I suppose we'll have an opportunity to test it shortly." "Indeed." Gideon stepped forward, and I could feel the magical pressure radiating from him intensifying. His power signature was impressive, not quite at his father's level, but far beyond what most people achieved at our age. The terms are simple: single combat to yield or incapacitation. Victory demonstrates worthiness to maintain the compact. Defeat voids it entirely. And if I refuse, then my father's obligation to wait 6 years is immediately dissolved. Gideon's smile widened. Though I suspect that outcome would be less educational than what I'm offering. There was something in his tone that suggested he viewed this entire encounter as a form of entertainment. The kind of casual cruelty that came from growing up believing other people existed primarily for your amusement. "Then I accept," I said simply. "Excellent." Gideon moved to create space between us, his delegation stepping back to form a proper fighting circle. "Shall we begin?" Without further preamble, he drew his weapon, and I immediately understood why he carried such confidence. The axe that emerged from its specialized sheath was magnificent. A two-handed weapon that radiated power in ways that made the air itself shimmer. The blade appeared to be forged from some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light, while the handle was wrapped in leather that looked suspiciously like it might be made from something exotic and dangerous. Most importantly, the weapon's magical signature immediately marked it as an ancient-grade artifact, the kind of weapon that most people only read about in historical texts. It was probably worth more than entire kingdoms, and it had undoubtedly been crafted specifically for the Axe King's bloodline. "Well," Luna observed with interest, "that's certainly impressive. Ancient-grade weapons are nothing to take lightly." "Neither is Evolvus," I replied, drawing my own sword with the kind of fluid motion that had become second nature after years of practice. The contrast between our weapons was immediately apparent to anyone with magical sensitivity. Where Gideon's axe radiated dark power and ancient craftsmanship, Evolvus hummed with a different kind of ancient-grade energy, the kind of adaptive potential that marked it as something that had grown beyond its original parameters. My sword had evolved alongside my development, advancing its capabilities to match my skills, and it now possessed ancient-grade qualities that went far beyond traditional weapon crafting. "Interesting," Gideon said, studying Evolvus with obvious appreciation and perhaps a hint of surprise. "Ancient grade as well." Gideon's posture shifted as he prepared for combat, and I could see the years of professional training that had shaped his approach to violence. His stance was perfect, his grip on the ancient weapon confident, his positioning calculated to maximize the advantages his superior reach and weapon weight would provide. But what struck me most was his expression. the kind of pleased anticipation that suggested he expected this to be easy. "He's underestimating you," Luna observed. "That could be useful." "It's about to be educational," I agreed, feeling Valeria's presence stirring at the edges of my consciousness. Ready to integrate the moment I gave the command. "Ready when you are," I said, my smile matching his for sharpness. Gideon's grin was predatory as he settled into his own fighting stance. "Try not to disappoint me, Arthur Nightingale. I'd hate for this to be over too quickly." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. In a few moments, one of us was indeed going to be very disappointed by how quickly this ended. I was fairly certain it wasn't going to be me. "Begin when ready," called Deputy Pope Ravik, apparently serving as an impromptu referee for this impromptu duel. Gideon's confidence was palpable as he hefted his ancient weapon, clearly expecting his superior equipment and bloodline advantages to carry the day. He was about to learn that sometimes evolution trumps inheritance. Chapter 599. Savage Communion 3. The moment stretched between us like a drawn bowstring, tension building as both Gideon and I prepared for what was about to unfold. Then, without warning, I felt it. The familiar pulse deep within my chest as my sword heart began to beat with the rhythm of impending combat. And as if synchronized by some cosmic force, Gideon's axe heart responded in kind. The sensation was extraordinary, feeling the resonance between our respective hearts as they began their work. My sword heart compressed mana with practiced efficiency, transforming it into the pure astral energy that had become my signature enhancement. The silvery radiance flowed along Evolvus's blade like liquid starlight, coating the ancient grade steel with power that made the air itself shimmer. Across from me, Gideon's axe heart performed its own transformation, though with a distinctly different character. Dark energy flowed along his weapon's edge. Not the pure astral energy I wielded, but something tainted with the corruption that marked all Savage Communion magic. The combination of mana and miasma created an aura around his axe that spoke of violence and barely contained destruction. "Impressive," Gideon said, his golden eyes studying the energy coating my blade with newfound respect. "I wasn't expecting you to have developed a heart so young. This might actually be interesting." "He's still underestimating you," Luna observed. "Good. Let him keep thinking this is just about hearts and weapons." Without further preamble, we moved. The clash when our weapons met was like thunder given physical form. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the air, causing the watching Savage Communion members to step back and creating small craters in the reinforced ground beneath our feet. His axe was heavier than my sword, significantly so. The ancient-grade weapon carried momentum that threatened to overwhelm my guard with pure kinetic force. Gideon himself was physically stronger, his body enhanced not just by his superior mana rank, but by the bloodline advantages that made the Axe King's family legendary. Every exchange of blows drove home the reality that I was fighting someone who outclassed me in raw physical capability. It was impossible to expect victory through conventional means against an opponent like this. The realization crystallized as Gideon's next strike forced me back several steps, my enhanced ascendant rank physiology barely managing to absorb the impact without serious damage. He pressed his advantage immediately, his fighting style a perfect blend of inherited technique and brutal effectiveness. "Is this the extent of the great Arthur Nightingale's power?" he taunted, raising his axe high as the corrupted astral energy around it intensified. "My father spoke of potential, but I see only mediocrity dressed in academy pretensions." I pulled my sword back and inhaled deeply, centering myself for what needed to come next. Second movement of my grade 6 art, Hollow Eclipse. The movement was poetry written in violence. 2 layers of astral energy formed around Evolvus, but between them, dark spots of deep dark energy created zones of absolute void that seemed to devour light itself. The technique represented the synthesis of opposing forces, creation and destruction, light and darkness, existence and nothingness. That movement clashed against Gideon's descending axe with a sound like reality tearing. Boom! The explosion of conflicting energies sent both of us sliding backward, our feet carving furrows in the reinforced ground. When the dust cleared, I could see that Gideon's confident expression had shifted to something more serious. "A grade 6 art," he said with genuine appreciation, "and one that incorporates deep dark principles. You're more developed than the reports suggested." "The reports were incomplete," I replied, settling into a new stance as I prepared to escalate further. Gideon's response was to activate what I immediately recognized as his gift. Golden energy erupted around him. Not the enhanced astral power of his heart, but something far more fundamental. His bloodline gift manifested as what appeared to be supernatural enhancement. Strength, speed, and reflexes amplified beyond normal magical limits. "Interesting," Luna observed. "His gift appears to be some form of supernatural empowerment. That explains the golden energy signature. Behold the blessing of violence incarnate," Gideon announced, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of power beyond mortal limits. "The Iron Maw bloodline doesn't just inherit strength. We inherit the right to wield it without restraint." He moved with speed that made my enhanced perception struggle to track, closing the distance between us in what felt like an instant. His axe descended in an arc that would have bisected a normal opponent, but I was no longer fighting conventionally. First movement of my grade 5 art CQC, Arc Hook Spiral. The technique transformed my sword work into something that transcended traditional weapon combat. Instead of meeting his axe directly, I redirected its momentum using principles that incorporated both martial and magical enhancement. My blade traced a precise arc that hooked around his weapon's shaft, while my body moved in a spiral pattern that turned his greater strength against him. The result was spectacular. Gideon's overwhelming attack became the source of his own imbalance as I used his momentum to send him stumbling past me. But his recovery was equally impressive, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to turn the stumble into a spinning strike that forced me to activate my next technique immediately. Second movement of my grade 5 art CQC, Ground Reversal Stomp. I drove my foot into the reinforced ground with enough force to crater the surface, but the real technique was in how I channeled astral energy through the impact. The resulting shockwave traveled through the earth and erupted directly beneath Gideon's feet, disrupting his footing at the crucial moment when he was committed to his spinning attack. He adapted faster than I'd expected, using his gift-enhanced reflexes to leap over the disrupted ground and convert his stumble into an aerial assault. His axe came down like divine judgment, wreathed in corrupted astral energy that promised devastating consequences. Third movement of my grade 5 art CQC, Phantom Step Knee. The technique was my answer to aerial attacks, a movement that combined spatial displacement with devastating close-range combat. I seemed to vanish from where I'd been standing, reappearing directly beside Gideon's descending form with my knee driving upward toward his ribs. The phantom aspect of the movement made it nearly impossible to defend against, as I was essentially attacking from a position that didn't exist until the moment of impact. Gideon's response demonstrated why the Axe King's bloodline was legendary. Instead of trying to block an attack he couldn't see coming, he embraced the impact, using his gift-enhanced durability to absorb the blow while bringing his axe around in a strike that would take my head off if it connected. We separated again, both of us breathing harder now as the intensity of the combat escalated beyond what normal fighters could sustain. "Exceptional technique," Gideon acknowledged, golden energy still wreathing his form. "But technique alone won't overcome the fundamental differences in our capabilities." He raised his hand, and I felt the air around us shift as he began channeling both mana and miasma simultaneously. The combination created an oppressive atmosphere that spoke of corruption and power working in unnatural harmony. "Let me show you what true power looks like," he said, and the dark energy around his axe intensified until it seemed to bend light around itself. "He's escalating," Luna warned. "That level of miasma corruption is dangerous even for someone at your level." "Then it's time to escalate in return," I replied, feeling the familiar stirring of power that marked my preparation for a truly serious response. Soul resonance. The transformation was immediate and profound. Luna's ancient power flowed through our mental connection, enhancing my physical and magical capabilities far beyond their normal limits. My body became mythic in nature, stronger, faster, more durable than any normal enhancement could provide. More importantly, my perception expanded to include soul vision, allowing me to see the true nature of Gideon's power and the weaknesses hidden within his seeming invincibility, which were hidden from even Seraphim's embrace. Through soul vision, I could see that his gift came with costs. The supernatural enhancement was burning through his stamina at an unsustainable rate, while the combination of mana and miasma was creating internal corruption that would eventually turn against him. But more immediately, I could see the patterns of his movement, the telegraphs of his attacks, the moments of vulnerability that his overwhelming power normally concealed. "Interesting," Gideon said, studying my transformed state with obvious intrigue. "You continue to exceed expectations. But let's see how your innovations handle this." He moved with speed that defied physics, his gift-enhanced capabilities pushing him beyond what should have been possible for someone of his rank. His axe came at me from 3 different angles simultaneously, not through any mystical technique, but through movement so fast that it created the illusion of multiple attacks. But soul vision let me see the truth beneath the illusion. There was only one real attack, hidden among the feints and misdirections. 5th movement of my Grade 5 Art CQC, 1-inch punch. The technique was deceptively simple, a punch delivered from point-blank range with minimal wind-up. But the astral energy channeled through the movement transformed it into something that could shatter castle walls. I stepped into Gideon's attack pattern, my fist connecting with his solar plexus at the exact moment when his momentum committed him to his strike. The impact sent him flying backward, his gift-enhanced durability the only thing that prevented the blow from ending the fight immediately. He hit the ground hard but rolled to his feet with predatory grace, golden blood now visible at the corner of his mouth. "First blood to you," he acknowledged with genuine respect. "I underestimated your capabilities. That won't happen again." The golden energy around him intensified further, his gift pushing into realms that made the air itself tremble with barely contained power. When he raised his axe again, the weapon seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Now let me show you why bloodline trumps innovation," he said, and launched himself forward with speed that made his previous attacks look sluggish. 1st movement of my Grade 6 Art, God Flash. The world exploded into radiance as divine light erupted from my form, moving at speeds that approached the conceptual rather than merely physical. The technique was my answer to opponents who thought speed was the ultimate advantage, movement so fast that it existed in the realm of pure possibility rather than normal physics. I appeared behind Gideon before the light of my departure had faded, Evolvus already in motion toward what my senses revealed as a critical vulnerability in his defense. But his response proved why the Axe King's bloodline was legendary even among the Savage Communion. Instead of trying to turn and block, he simply vanished. Not teleportation or any mystical technique. Pure speed enhanced by his gift to levels that challenged my enhanced perception. He reappeared above me, his axe descending with force that promised to split the earth itself. So I changed my movement. God Flash, Absolute. The enhanced version of my technique transformed speed into something approaching divine intervention. I moved through space and time as if they were merely suggestions, my blade meeting his axe in a clash that sent shockwaves rippling across multiple dimensions. When the energy cleared, we stood locked in mutual guard, our weapons crossed and trembling with the force each of us was channeling. But I could see through soul vision that this level of output was unsustainable for both of us. Impressive, Gideon panted, golden energy flickering around his form as his gift began to waver. But even your techniques can't overcome the fundamental gap in our capabilities. He was right, and we both knew it. Despite everything I'd thrown at him, Grade 5 and Grade 6 arts, soul resonance, divine techniques that pushed the boundaries of what magic could achieve, he was still standing, still fighting, still dangerous. The truth was, I had been holding back my greatest advantage, waiting to see if conventional techniques could carry the day. But Gideon's power and skill had proven that this fight would require everything I could bring to bear. It was time to show him what true innovation looked like. Erebus, I called out, feeling my lich's presence responding immediately to my summons. Chapter 600. Savage Communion 4. Erebus materialized from shadows and dark energy, his ancient undead presence immediately shifting the balance of power on the battlefield. The Lich's form was imposing, tall and regal despite his skeletal nature, with robes that seemed to be woven from darkness itself and eye sockets that burned with eldritch fire. Master! His voice resonated with the authority of an ancient consciousness. I am at your service. Gideon's confident expression shifted to something more wary as he studied my summon. An ancient undead. Interesting. But surely you don't think. He never finished the sentence. Erebus's magic struck like a tide of darkness, bone spears erupting from the ground beneath Gideon's feet, while necromantic energy sought to drain his enhanced vitality. Simultaneously, I launched myself forward with supernatural speed. Evolvus wreathed in pure light radiance as it sought the openings that Erebus's assault had created. Gideon's response demonstrated the combat instincts that made his bloodline legendary. His gift flared to even greater intensity, golden energy forming a protective barrier that shattered Erebus's bone spears while his axe traced impossible arcs that deflected my assault. But I could see through soul vision that the effort was costing him. His life force was burning away at an alarming rate, even as his superior mana reserves allowed him to maintain output that I couldn't match. Erebus followed up with waves of necromantic magic. Death bolts that seared through the air, bone constructs that emerged from the earth to harass our opponent, and draining spells that sought to weaken Gideon's supernatural enhancement. The Lich's tactical intelligence was evident in how he coordinated his attacks with my movements, creating openings that neither of us could have achieved alone. I flowed through my enhanced techniques with the benefit of our coordination. My redirecting spiral became devastatingly effective when timed with Erebus's magical assaults, while my ground-shattering stomp created opportunities for the Lich to manifest bone spikes from the fractured earth. But Gideon was adapting faster than I'd hoped. His gift allowed him to channel both enhanced strength and corrupted energy simultaneously, creating a fighting style that overwhelmed through pure supernatural force. His axe began leaving trails of golden miasma that poisoned the air itself, while his movements gained an otherworldly quality that made him difficult to track even with soul vision. You fight well with ancient support, he called out between exchanges. But you're still just delaying the inevitable. To prove his point, he unleashed what appeared to be his own inherited technique. A devastating axe art that carved through both my attacks and Erebus's magical barriers. The strike came at me from multiple angles, bypassing normal physics through pure application of supernatural power. I called upon the wings of Seraphim, feeling the familiar burn as the pure light spell inscribed on my skin activated. 6 wings of pure radiance erupted from my back, each one blazing with holy fire that made the very air sing with power. The wings provided flight, enhanced speed, protective barriers, and most importantly, they allowed me to channel pure light energy at levels far beyond normal spellcasting. My entire being became suffused with radiant energy that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum of magic. Evolvus blazed with pure light enhancement, while my movements gained a fluidity that transcended normal physical limitations. Impossible, Gideon breathed, his golden eyes wide with shock. Those markings, you have a miracle inscribed. How does someone your age have access to such power? Because, Luna's voice carried satisfaction through our mental link. You've pushed yourself beyond normal limits in every way possible. The wings allowed me to move through 3-dimensional space with perfect freedom. I attacked from above, below, and angles that conventional ground-based combat couldn't reach, each strike backed by pure light energy that could burn through supernatural defenses. Erebus coordinated his necromantic assaults with my aerial movements, creating combination attacks that operated on multiple planes simultaneously. But even faced with a miracle-enhanced opponent, Gideon refused to yield. His gift pushed beyond safe limits, his body beginning to show the strain of channeling power that threatened to consume him. Golden blood now flowed from his eyes and nose, while his movements gained a desperate quality that spoke of someone fighting on borrowed time. If you want to escalate, he snarled, raising his axe high as corruption and supernatural energy swirled around him in impossible harmony. Then let me show you what happens when bloodline power stops holding back. The attack that followed was beyond anything I'd seen from him before. His axe became a conduit for raw supernatural force that seemed to channel violence itself. The strike came at me from every direction simultaneously, bypassing my aerial advantages through sheer conceptual impact. Even with the wings of Seraphim, even with Erebus's ancient magic supporting me, even with every advantage I'd developed, the attack connected. The impact sent me crashing to the ground, my wings flickering as the inscribed miracle struggled to maintain cohesion under the assault. A Volvis flew from my hand, landing several meters away as I struggled to maintain consciousness. And that, Gideon said, breathing heavily but still standing, is why raw power matters more than technique. Arthur, Luna's voice carried urgent concern. You're badly injured. If you don't do something immediately. Through soul vision, I could see that Gideon was in worse shape than he appeared. His gift had burned through most of his life force, and the combination of enhancement and corrupted energy was tearing his body apart from the inside. But he still had enough power left to finish this fight if I didn't act quickly. Erebus was already moving to protect me, necromantic magic weaving barriers and launching desperate attacks designed to buy time for my recovery. But we both knew it wouldn't be enough against Gideon's remaining supernatural strength. There was only one option left, the capability that represented the absolute pinnacle of my winter break achievements. Valeria, I called out, my voice carrying across the battlefield. The response was immediate and spectacular. My symbiotic ancient undead didn't just appear. She manifested from the air around me, her consciousness flowing into perfect integration with my damaged form. The symbiosis was seamless, natural, as if we had always been meant to exist as a unified entity. The transformation was beyond anything the watching crowd had expected. My injuries began healing immediately as Valeria's ancient consciousness merged with my own, while my magical and physical capabilities expanded beyond their normal limits. The symbiosis granted me access to capabilities that no single entity could possess. What? Gideon's voice carried shock and growing alarm as he watched my reconstruction. What is that? Symbiosis, I replied, rising to my feet with movements that flowed like liquid grace. Something you've never encountered before. The figure that faced Gideon now was neither Arthur Nightingale nor Valeria individually, but something greater than the sum of our parts. Ancient wisdom guided enhanced reflexes, while symbiotic consciousness provided capabilities that challenged normal magical limitations. Gideon's exhausted form still radiated power, but I could see through our enhanced perception that he was operating on reserves that wouldn't last much longer. His gift was consuming him from within, while the corruption he'd channeled was beginning to turn against his own systems. The final exchange was brief but decisive. Gideon's remaining supernatural power met the unified force of ancient symbiosis, and for a moment the outcome hung in perfect balance. But where his strength was burning him alive, mine was sustained by perfect coordination between two consciousness working as one. His axe met a Volvis in a clash that sent shockwaves through the air, but the ancient weapon couldn't withstand the enhanced force I could now channel. The blade shattered, fragments of metal ringing against the ground as Gideon himself collapsed, his gift finally burning itself out. Yield, I said quietly, standing over his prone form with a Volvis at his throat. Gideon looked up at me with eyes that held newfound respect alongside exhaustion. I yield, he said finally. The compact stands. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind across the border installation. Around us, the Savage Communion delegation stood in stunned recognition of what they'd witnessed. Deputy Pope Ravik stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The challenge has been met and answered. The Axe King's compact with Arthur Nightingale remains in effect. As Valeria separated from my form, returning to her independent state while my injuries finished healing, I reflected on what had just transpired. The fight had pushed me beyond every limit I'd thought I possessed, and also proved how strong Valeria was. Gideon was helped to his feet by his companions, but before leaving, he turned back to face me one final time. Arthur Nightingale, he said with genuine respect, I understand now why my father spoke of your potential. When the time comes for your duel with him, you'll provide the worthy combat he seeks. I look forward to it, I replied honestly.